The damp, stale air of the cave system felt like a heavy shroud, pressing against Commander Rashid's skin as he stood in the flickering shadows. Outside, the sun was beginning to bake the jagged Afghan landscape, but in here, time seemed to stand still, frozen in a cycle of vengeance and preparation. Rashid slammed his fist against the ancient stone wall, the impact sending a dull thud echoing through the tunnels. His eyes burned with a hatred that had not just grown, but festered like an open wound for months. Today, the waiting would end. Today, the blood would flow. He looked at the men gathered around him, 30 insurgents, their faces hardened by a lifetime of conflict, their hands moving with methodical, terrifying precision as they checked their weapons. The click of magazines sliding into place and the dry rasp of bolts being pulled back were the only music in this tomb of a mountain. Today we slaughter them all. Rashid's voice boomed, low and jagged, scraping against the stone walls. Every American dog that rolls through the Karsa Basin dies. No survivors. No mercy. He stepped toward a young fighter, barely more than a boy, whose hands were trembling as he gripped an old AK-47. Rashid grabbed him by the collar, pulling him so close their foreheads nearly touched. The boy could smell the tobacco and the old, cold rage on the commander's breath. "You remember what they did to your brother?" Rashid hissed. "You remember what they did to your family?" The young man's eyes welled with tears, but his expression hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He nodded, a sharp, jerky movement. Rashid released him with a shove and turned to address the entire group. "This is our land, our valley, and today we paint it with their blood. We will show them that the earth itself rejects their presence. Before we continue with this story of betrayal, courage, and one woman's impossible choice, hit that subscribe button right now. Watch this entire story to the end, because what happens in those final moments will leave you speechless. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this incredible true story travels. Now, let's get back to the day everything changed, a day where the line between a hero and a traitor became thin enough to snap. 3,000 miles away from the cold darkness of Rashid's cave, Elena Cruz sat in a world of blinding light and stifling heat. The communications tent at Forward Operating Base Alvarado was a sweltering box of canvas and electronics that smelled of ozone, burnt coffee, and the pervasive, fine dust of the desert. Elena was staring at intercept reports that everyone else in the chain of command had dismissed as routine chatter, the background noise of a country at war. But to her, the noise was starting to sound like a scream. Her fingers traced the same coordinates on the digital map over and over again, until the lines seemed burned into her retinas. Karsa Basin. Just looking at the name on the screen made her skin crawl, a primal instinct of danger that her superiors refused to acknowledge. "You're wasting your time, Cruz," Corporal Matthews muttered from across the tent. He didn't even bother to look up from his stained, month-old magazine. Intel already cleared that route twice this morning. The drone is over the ridge as we speak, and it's seeing nothing but goats and rocks. Give it a rest before you give yourself an ulcer. Elena's jaw tightened so hard it ached. She'd been at this base for 11 months, nearly a year of living in the dust and the heat. She had qualified as an expert marksman 3 times, her scores at the range putting most of the infantry to shame. She had requested sniper training twice, her letters of recommendation impeccable, and both times she had been told the same thing. She was more valuable in communications. More valuable. She knew what that really meant. It was their polite, bureaucratic way of saying she didn't fit the image of what a sniper should be. They wanted her behind a desk, filtering signals, not behind a long-range rifle where she belonged. The chatter increased 40% in the last 72 hours, Elena said, keeping her voice level and professional despite the frustration boiling in her chest. All of it is focused on the grid squares surrounding the basin approach. That isn't just noise, Matthews. It's a crescendo. Matthews finally glanced over, his eyes dull with the boredom of a man who had checked out months ago. "So, it's a holiday week for the locals. They talk more. They always talk more. So that's not routine," Elena countered. "That's coordination. Look at the timing of the bursts. They aren't random. They're responding to our logistics movements." Matthews laughed, a dry, mocking sound that scraped against her nerves like sandpaper. Coordination. Jesus, Cruz, you have been reading too many spy novels in your bunk. It's goat herders talking about goat herder shit. They're probably arguing over the price of a rug or who stole whose chicken. You're looking for ghosts in a graveyard. Elena stood abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the plywood floor, a sound that cut through the low hum of the servers. She didn't say another word to him. She grabbed the stack of printouts, her knuckles white as she gripped the paper, and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Matthews called after her, his voice trailing off into a yawn. To talk to someone who actually gives a damn, she threw back over her shoulder as she pushed through the heavy canvas flap and out into the blinding midday sun. Captain Oakes looked exactly how Elena expected he would, deeply annoyed at being interrupted. He was hunched over a makeshift desk, which was really just a piece of plywood balanced on 2 olive-drab ammo crates. He was signing requisition forms with the weary enthusiasm of someone signing their own death warrant. The air in his office was thick with the smell of unwashed uniforms and the stale heat of the afternoon. "Sir, I need 2 minutes of your time," Elena said, not waiting for permission. She moved to the desk and spread the intercept reports across it, physically covering the paperwork he had been working on. She needed him to see this, to really see it. "The convoy scheduled for 0600 tomorrow. I think it's walking into a planned ambush. A big one." Oakes leaned back, his plastic chair creaking under his weight. He rubbed his eyes with the palms of his hands, then looked up at her with a heavy, tired gaze. "You think?" "The pattern of the signals, sir. The frequency, the geographic concentration. It all points to a massive buildup of personnel in the high ground overlooking the basin," Elena explained, her words coming out in a rush. "Karsa Basin is a natural funnel. If you wanted to kill a lot of people in a short amount of time, that's exactly where you do it." "Sergeant Cruz," Oakes said, cutting her off with the practiced precision of a man who had ended this exact conversation 100 times before. "Do you have any idea how many intercepts we process every single day? Hundreds, thousands. And do you know how many of those turn out to be actual, actionable intelligence? Maybe 2% on a good week. Most of it is just static." "Sir, this is different," Elena insisted, her voice rising slightly. "The timing matches the convoy's departure to the minute. And that data has already been analyzed by actual intelligence specialists," Sergeant Oakes said, his voice dropping into a tone of stern finality. "People who are specifically trained to do exactly this job. They looked at the same reports you did and they found nothing worth flagging. Nothing." Elena felt the heat rising in her chest, a mixture of anger and a cold, sinking dread. "With respect, sir, those specialists aren't looking at the terrain correlation. They're sitting in an air-conditioned room in Virginia or at a desk in Kabul. They haven't walked that ground. They don't see how the shadows fall in that valley. Karsa Basin is a kill box. If I were planning an ambush, that's exactly where I'd... But you're not planning an ambush, are you, Cruz?" Oakes stood up now, his patience clearly exhausted. His shadow fell over her, tall and imposing. "You're a communications specialist who happens to shoot well at the range. That doesn't make you an intelligence analyst. And it certainly doesn't make you a tactical planner. My job is to manage the reality of this base, not to chase phantoms based on the gut feelings of a sergeant who's frustrated she isn't in the field. It sure as hell doesn't make you qualified to second-guess decisions made by officers with 20 years of combat experience." The words hit like physical blows, knocking the wind out of her. Elena gathered her papers with shaking hands, her fingers fumbling against the plywood. She could feel the dismissal in every inch of the room. "The convoy rolls at 0600 as scheduled," Oakes said, already sitting back down and returning to his forms as if she had already disappeared. "You're dismissed, Sergeant." Elena walked out of that office with her throat tight and her vision blurred. It wasn't from tears. She had stopped crying over this kind of patronizing dismissal months ago. It was from pure, undiluted rage, a fire that burned in her gut and made her hands tremble. She walked through the dusty lanes of the FOB, the heat radiating off the gravel and the shipping containers, feeling like a ghost in her own life. Back at her tent, she ignored the heat and pulled out her personal tablet. She opened the topographical maps she downloaded weeks ago, the ones she had spent hours studying in the dead of night. Karsa Basin spread across the screen in a web of elevation lines and contour markers. She traced the route with her finger, feeling the jagged edges of the terrain even through the glass. The convoy would enter from the northwest, following the dry wadi through the narrowest section of the canyon, then climb out the southeastern ridge. It was a perfect kill box. There was high ground on 3 sides, limited egress routes, and enough civilian goat trail traffic to provide cover for insurgent positioning without raising immediate alarms. She had studied this terrain during every spare moment she had. She had even hiked sections of it during her off-duty hours. earning strange, mocking looks from other Marines who couldn't understand why anyone would voluntarily spend their free time walking through 100-degree heat. But she had needed to see it, to feel the way the wind moved through the gaps in the rocks, to understand how an enemy would use that land against them. Her tent mate Lance Corporal Rodriguez pushed through the flap carrying 2 condensation-covered bottles of water. She saw Elena hunched over the tablet and sighed. "Heard you tried to warn Oaks. News travels fast," Elena muttered without looking up. "Matthews has a big mouth," Rodriguez said, handing her one of the bottles. It was cool against Elena's skin, a brief moment of relief. "Also, he thinks you're paranoid. He's telling everyone who will listen that you're trying to play hero." "Matthews thinks anyone with ovaries is paranoid," Elena said, twisting the cap off and taking a long, cold drink that did nothing to soothe the fire in her chest. "What do you think, Rodriguez?" Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. She sat on her footlocker, the metal creaking under her weight. "I think you see patterns other people miss, Elena. I've seen you do it before. But I also think that sometimes people miss patterns because there's nothing actually there. Sometimes a coincidence is just a coincidence. And sometimes it's a death sentence," Elena said, turning the tablet so Rodriguez could see the map. "Look at this. If they hit the lead vehicle here and the rear vehicle here, the entire column is trapped in a 300-yard stretch of open ground with no cover and no way out. You going to let this go?" Rodriguez asked softly. Elena stared at the map. 480 Marines. Most of them were younger than her, kids who still had letters from home tucked into their vests and pictures of their girlfriends taped inside their helmets. They were heading into a valley that screamed danger to anyone willing to listen, and the people in charge were deaf. "I don't know," Elena whispered. Rodriguez leaned forward, her expression earnest. "You can't save everyone, Cruz, and you definitely can't save people who don't want to be saved. You've done your part. You told the captain. You did your duty. They don't know they need saving," Elena said, her voice growing harder. "Then convince them." "I tried." Elena snapped, her frustration finally boiling over. "I tried, and they treated me like a child playing dress-up." Rodriguez stood up and put a hand on Elena's shoulder, a rare gesture of physical comfort in a place that discouraged it. "Then you did your job. Whatever happens tomorrow, it's not on you. You told them. The rest is on the officers." But Elena knew it was on her. She knew it with the same bone-deep certainty she knew her own name. If those Marines rolled into Karsa Basin and the world went sideways, she would carry that weight for the rest of her life. She would see their faces in the dark every time she closed her eyes. Sleep didn't come that night. Elena lay in her rack, staring up at the dark canvas ceiling, listening to the sounds of the FOB settling into its restless midnight rhythm. The generators hummed with a constant, low-frequency vibration that seemed to rattle her teeth. Guard rotations called out challenges in the distance, their voices thin and sharp in the night air. Somewhere, someone was playing music too loudly, earning muttered curses from nearby tents. It was the sound of 100 lives waiting for the sun to come up, oblivious to the fact that for many of them it might be the last time. At 0300, she gave up on the illusion of sleep entirely. She got up, dressed in silence, and walked to the communication center. The night shift was always quieter, staffed by junior Marines who hadn't yet learned to hate the monotony of the job or who were too tired to care. "Couldn't sleep, Sergeant." Private Chen looked up from his station, his face illuminated by the blue glow of a dozen monitors. "Something like that," Elena said, trying to sound casual. "Mind if I run through the intercepts one more time? I feel like I missed something in the afternoon report." Chen shrugged, moving his legs to let her pass. "Knock yourself out. Coffee's fresh if you want some, though it tastes like it was brewed in a radiator." Elena poured herself a cup of the black, bitter sludge and settled into a corner workstation. She pulled up every intercept from the past 96 hours, filtering them by geographic markers, frequency patterns, and encryption levels. She went deeper than the automated software usually allowed, digging into the raw data. The software flagged a dozen as potentially noteworthy, but she read through hundreds. Most were mundane, weather reports, market prices for livestock, family gossip. But then she found 3 that hadn't been linked before. The first was from a low-power handheld radio translated roughly as, "The canyon will bloom red before sunset." The second, intercepted 2 hours later, all brothers in position by dawn. And the third, the one that made her blood turn to ice, had been intercepted just 6 hours ago. The sheep walked to slaughter willingly. Individually, the analysts had dismissed them as poetic local dialect or religious metaphors. But together, Factored into the timing and the geography she had already mapped, they were a roadmap to a massacre. Elena's hands moved before her conscious mind could even process the fear. She printed everything, highlighting the key phrases with a yellow marker that looked like a neon warning light. She cross-referenced the times with the convoy route and the projected timeline. It was all there. It was undeniable. She headed back to Captain Oakes's quarters. The camp was pitch black now, the only light coming from the distant perimeter flares and the dim red glow of the tactical lights. Oakes's tent was dark. She stood outside for 30 seconds, the cold desert air biting at her skin, trying to decide if waking a commanding officer at 0330 would be the end of her career or the beginning of her salvation. It would probably hurt her case. It would definitely make him hate her. She knocked anyway, the sound of her knuckles against the wooden frame of the door sounding like gunshots in the silence. "What?" Oakes's voice came muffled and thick with sleep, sharp with immediate anger. "Sir, it's Sergeant Cruz. I have new information, urgent information about the Karsa Basin convoy." There was a long, heavy pause. "Cruz, I swear to God if this is about those goat herders again." "Sir, please, just 2 minutes. New intercepts came through the night shift. They are specific, sir. They're tactical." She heard movement inside, a series of muttered curses and the rustle of clothing. Then the flap pushed open and Oakes emerged. He was in PT shorts and a tank top, his hair a mess, looking like a man who was very close to committing a violent act. "This better be the second coming of Christ, Sergeant." Elena handed him the printouts. He scanned them with a small tactical flashlight, the beam bouncing across the highlighted text. His expression moved from angry to annoyed, and then for a flickering second to something that might have been actual consideration. "These are vague as hell, Cruz," he said, but his voice lacked the sharp edge it had held before. "Bloom red, sheep to slaughter, this is how they talk. It doesn't mean a coordinated hit." "Yes, sir, but the timing," she pushed. "The positions. It all matches the high ground positions I flagged yesterday." "It could be a coincidence," Oakes said, though he didn't hand the papers back. "Could be," Elena agreed, her voice steady. "Or it could be 480 Marines walking into an ambush at 0600 because we were too stubborn to change a plan based on possibilities instead of certainties. If we roll and I'm wrong, we lose a few hours of transit time. If we roll and I'm right, we lose everyone." Oakes looked at her for a long moment. In the dim light, she couldn't read his eyes, but she could feel the weight of the command decision pressing down on him. "You really believe this?" "Yes, sir, with everything I have. Enough to stake your career on it?" Oakes asked. The question landed like a grenade between them. Elena understood exactly what he was offering and what it would cost. If she pushed this and she was wrong, she would be the sergeant who cried wolf. She would be a pariah. Her chances at sniper school, her future in the Corps, everything she had worked for would evaporate. But if she was right and said nothing, the cost would be measured in body bags. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'd stake my career on it." Oakes handed the papers back to her. Then brief Lieutenant Colonel Barnes at 0500. He's the convoy commander. He's over at the TOC getting the final weather brief. If you can convince him, he's the only one who can make the call to delay or reroute. Hope flared in Elena's chest, a sudden, sharp heat. "Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Cruz," Oakes said, turning back toward his tent. "Barnes eats junior sergeants for breakfast, and he's got about as much patience for intelligence theories as I do. You've got 90 minutes. Make them count." He paused at the flap, looking back at her. "But for what it's worth." "I hope you're wrong." "Me too, sir," Elena whispered to the darkness. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes looked like he had been carved out of a single block of granite and bad decisions. He was standing in the Tactical Operations Center at exactly 0500, surrounded by maps, radios, and a dozen staff officers who looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. When Elena entered the room, every head turned. She felt like a stray cat in a room full of hounds. "Sir, Sergeant Cruz requesting permission to present intelligence concerns regarding today's mission," she said, her voice projecting through the room. Barnes didn't even look up from the logistics overlays. "You've got 3 minutes, Sergeant. Use them wisely, because at 0505, I'm walking out that door and we're moving out." Elena launched into her brief. She didn't stumble. She didn't hesitate. She laid out the intercept patterns, the terrain analysis, the historical data of the basin, and the specific wording of the last 3 messages. She spoke with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed this 1,000 times in her head. She could feel the skepticism radiating from the officers around the table, a physical heat that rivaled the desert sun. When she finished, she stood at attention, waiting. Barnes finally looked up. His eyes were cold, professional, and entirely unimpressed. "That's your evidence? Poetry and topography. Sir, the pattern is confirmation bias," Sergeant Major Hicks, the operations officer, interrupted. His voice was dripping with a condescending kind of pity. "You decided there was a threat, and then you went looking for data to support your conclusion. That's not intelligence analysis. That's wishful thinking. You're seeing what you want to see." "It's not wishful thinking when 480 lives are on the line, sir," Elena countered, her heart hammering against her ribs. 480 Marines who are trained, equipped, and ready for contact, Barnes said, his voice like grinding stones. "We don't change mission parameters based on hunches and linguistic interpretations. We have a schedule, we have objectives, we adapt and overcome whatever actually happens on the ground. We don't hide from shadows." Elena felt the moment slipping away. The room was already moving on, officers returning to their tasks, the clock ticking toward 0600. "Sir, I'm requesting permission to accompany the convoy as additional security," she said. The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. The room went dead silent. Barnes stared at her as if she had just suggested they fly to the moon on a magic carpet. "You're a communications specialist, Cruz. You have a station here. I'm also a qualified expert marksman with advanced terrain analysis training," she said, her voice desperate now. "I know that basin. I know where they'll be hiding. Training you got from YouTube videos and field manuals," Hicks sneered. "This isn't a game, Sergeant. This isn't a shooting range. This is actual combat operations. We don't have room for tourists who want to play sniper." Barnes held up a hand, silencing Hicks. He studied Elena for a long, agonizing moment. He saw the fire in her eyes, but to him it didn't look like competence, it looked like obsession. "Your request is denied, Sergeant. You will remain at the FOB and monitor communications as assigned." "Are we clear, sir? Are we clear, Sergeant?" Barnes's voice was a whip crack. Elena's throat felt like it was filled with sandpaper. Her heart felt like it was breaking. "Crystal clear, sir. Good. Dismissed." She walked out of the TOC, the cold morning air hitting her like a physical weight. She had failed. In less than an hour, the engines would roar to life, and those Marines would roll out toward the Karsa Basin, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. She stood in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the silhouettes of the Humvees and MRAPs forming a long, dark column. Marines were moving with casual efficiency, laughing, checking their gear, oblivious to the fact that they were driving toward a meat grinder. Elena made her decision in the space between two heartbeats. She walked quickly and quietly to the armory. The night armorer was a sleepy-eyed corporal who barely looked at her paperwork. She signed out her M40A5 sniper rifle and several boxes of match-grade ammunition, using her long-standing range certification as the justification. In the chaos of a pre-dawn convoy launch, no one questioned a sergeant with a rifle. Next, she moved to the motor pool. She found a maintenance Humvee near the back, the keys already in the ignition. There was always at least one left that way for quick repairs. She climbed in, her heart racing so fast she thought it might burst through her chest. "Whatever you're thinking, don't." Elena froze. Rodriguez was standing by the driver's side door, her arms crossed, her face a mask of worry. "I'm not thinking anything," Elena said, her voice tight. "You've got that look," Rodriguez said. "That same look you had before you punched Sergeant Morrison for grabbing my ass in the mess hall. You're about to do something that's going to get you sent to Leavenworth." "This is different," Elena said, starting the engine. The rumble of the diesel felt like a living thing beneath her. "This is career suicide, Cruz." Rodriguez gripped the door frame. "They told you no. Barnes told you no. You go rogue now, and you'll be lucky to avoid a court-martial. You're throwing your whole life away." "I know," Elena said, looking her friend in the eye. "Then why?" "Because I'm right," Elena said. "And if I'm right and I do nothing, I'll never forgive myself. I can live with a dishonorable discharge. I can't live with 400 dead Marines." Rodriguez stepped back, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're insane." Probably, Elena agreed. She put the Humvee in gear. "Tell them I stole it. Tell them you tried to stop me. I'll back you up on that." Cruz, Rodriguez started, but Elena was already rolling. She headed for the front gate before anyone could process what was happening. The gate guards, seeing a vehicle with the proper markings and a sergeant in the driver's seat, assumed she was part of the scouting or logistics element for the convoy. They waved her through without a second thought. And just like that, Elena Cruz became a deserter. She drove fast, pushing the Humvee harder than it was ever meant to go. She used the back routes she had memorized from her maps, shortcuts through dry, wadi beds and old goat paths that were barely wide enough for the wheels. The main convoy would take the established roads, which were easier but slower. Elena's route was a bone-jarring nightmare of rocks and dust, the suspension screaming with every jolt, but it would get her to the high ground overlooking the basin before the Marines even arrived at the entrance. If there was a kill zone, the thought haunted her as the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold. If she was wrong, she had destroyed her life for nothing. She would be the girl who went crazy and stole a truck. She'd be a cautionary tale told to new recruits. But as she rounded the final ridge and the Karsa Basin opened up below her, the feeling in her gut only intensified. She reached her chosen position, a rocky outcrop on the northern ridge that offered a commanding view of the entire valley. She killed the engine, grabbed her rifle and gear, and sprinted up the hillside. She found a natural hide between two massive boulders, a spot that provided both cover and an unobstructed line of sight. Elena settled into the dirt, the heat of the earth already seeping into her uniform. She set up the M40A5, checked her scope, and began ranging the distances. 800 yards to the floor, 1,200 to the opposite ridge. She marked potential positions of cover and concealment, her mind clicking into a cold, tactical gear. Her hands, which had been shaking in the truck, were now perfectly steady. This part she knew, this part made sense. Through her scope, the basin looked peaceful, empty. For a moment, her heart sank. Maybe she really was paranoid. Maybe she had thrown it all away for a ghost. Then movement caught her eye. On the eastern ridge, nearly a mile away, a shadow shifted. Elena adjusted the focus on her scope, her breath catching in her throat. A man. He was wearing local clothing, but he was carrying an RPG-7 launcher. He was partially concealed behind a jagged rock, his eyes fixed on the entrance to the basin. Elena's blood turned to ice. She swept her scope left and right, searching the ridgeline. There, another fighter, this one manning a PKM machine gun. And there, three more setting up what looked like a mortar tube in a shallow depression. "Oh God," she whispered to the empty air. "I was right. There were dozens of them. Maybe 30, maybe 50, all perfectly positioned to rain fire down on the valley floor." It wasn't just an ambush. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered trap. She grabbed her radio, switching it to the convoy's primary frequency. "Any station this net, this is Overwatch. You have hostile positions prepared along your route. I repeat, hostiles in position. Abort mission." Over, static was the only answer. The mountains were eating her signal. She tried again, her voice more urgent. "Convoy actual, this is Overwatch. You are rolling into an ambush. Multiple enemy positions confirmed. Request immediate halt." Over, more static. She looked through the scope and saw the dust cloud of the lead Humvee entering the basin. They were coming. They were driving right into the center of the trap, and they couldn't hear her. Elena's finger moved to the trigger. The math was impossible. She was one person with a bolt-action rifle against an entire insurgent company in prepared positions. Even if she started shooting, even if every shot was a kill, she couldn't stop them all. But she could change the timing. She centered her reticle on the fighter with the RPG. He was tracking the lead vehicle, his body tensing as he waited for the entire convoy to enter the kill box. Standard tactics: let them get deep, cut off the exits, then unleash hell. Elena controlled her breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Her heart rate slowed, her vision narrowing until the entire world existed only in the space between her crosshairs. The lead Humvee was almost in position. 4 vehicles were in now. 6, 8. The insurgent with the RPG stood up slightly, preparing to fire. Elena squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the recoil a familiar, comforting punch. Through the scope, she saw the RPG fighter's head snap back, his body crumpling as if his bones had turned to liquid. The launcher fell from his hands, clattering down the rocks and sliding into the abyss. The basin exploded. The insurgents, thinking the ambush had been triggered by their own side, erupted in a cacophony of gunfire. RPGs streaked across the valley, but because Elena had forced the timing, they were premature. The rockets slammed into the ground in front of the lead vehicles instead of hitting them broadside. Machine gun fire tore into the dirt and mortars started dropping, but the coordination was gone. Elena had triggered the trap early, and while it was still a nightmare, it wasn't the massacre Rashid had planned. She worked the bolt, the brass casing spinning away into the dust. She acquired a new target, the PKM gunner who was raking the second Humvee with sustained fire. She led him slightly, accounted for the windage, and fired. He folded over his weapon like a puppet with cut strings. "Unknown sniper, this is convoy actual." The radio crackled to life, Barnes's voice strained but controlled through the chaos. "Identify yourself?" Over, Elena ignored him. She was already finding her third target, a fighter moving between positions with an ammunition can. She fired and he went down hard. "Sniper, identify yourself or we will return fire on your position." Barnes yelled, his voice echoing through the hills. "Worry about the people actually trying to kill you, Barnes." Elena snapped back, the breach in radio discipline the least of her worries. She spotted another RPG team setting up on a ledge and put a round into the loader's chest before he could slide the rocket into the tube. Below her, the convoy was in a frantic scramble. Marines were pouring out of their vehicles, diving for whatever cover the flat valley floor provided. They were returning fire, but they were pinned down, the insurgents holding the high ground and the advantage. Elena shifted her position, crawling a few yards to a different rock to avoid being zeroed in on. She counted at least 4 different fighting positions on the western ridge. She engaged them methodically. Breathe, aim, squeeze. Work the bolt, find the next threat. The rifle barrel was starting to heat up, the air around her shimmering with the smell of cordite. A mortar round impacted 15 yards from her position, showering her with jagged rocks and stinging dust. They had spotted her muzzle flash. They were trying to suppress her. Elena rolled to her right, finding a new vantage point behind a slab of granite. The mathematics of the battle were still brutal. She was disrupting them, yes, but the Marines were still trapped in a kill box. They needed air support. They needed the QRF. "Convoy actual, this is Overwatch." Elena shouted into the radio, forcing herself to use the proper procedure. "Recommend immediate call for fire, grid November Whiskey 874,231. Heavy concentration of enemy personnel on the eastern and western ridges. Over." A pause, filled with the sound of distant explosions and gunfire. "Overwatch, your recommendation is noted. Now identify yourself. That's an order." "Over, I'm the person keeping you alive, sir." Elena yelled back, now calling that strike. She saw a group of insurgents trying to flank the rear of the convoy, moving down a narrow gully. She shifted her aim, her heart pounding. There were 6 of them. She took the leader first, then the man at the back to cause confusion. The remaining 4 scrambled for cover, their flanking maneuver stalled. Through the scope, she saw the lead Humvee take a direct hit from a mortar. The vehicle didn't explode, but it was disabled, smoke pouring from the engine. Marines were dragging a wounded comrade out of the wreckage, their movements frantic under the hail of bullets. Elena felt a cold, sharp clarity. She couldn't kill them all, but she could be the finger in the dike. She could hold the line until the cavalry arrived. She worked the bolt again, her hands moving with a grace she hadn't known she possessed. On the far ridge, she saw Rashid. She didn't know it was him, not for sure, but she saw a man who wasn't hiding, a man standing among the rocks, directing his fighters with a furious energy. He was holding a radio in one hand and a rifle in the other, his face a mask of thwarted rage. She centered the reticle on his chest. It was a long shot, nearly 1,000 yards, at the very edge of the M40A5's effective range. She adjusted for the upward angle and the shifting morning wind. She took a deep breath, held it, and felt the world go silent. Just as she began to squeeze the trigger, a shadow fell over her. "Don't move, Sergeant." Elena froze. The voice was familiar. She slowly looked up, her hands still on the rifle. Standing behind her, his face grim and his own rifle leveled at her, was Captain Oakes. He had followed her. He must have seen her take the Humvee and realized where she was going, or maybe he had known all along she would do this. "Captain," she whispered, "they're dying down there." "I know," Oakes said, his eyes flicking to the valley and then back to her. "But you're a deserter, Cruz. You're AWOL. You stole equipment. You disobeyed a direct order from a superior officer." "Shoot me later," Elena said, her voice turning cold as stone. "Right now, I have a job to do." She turned back to the scope. Rashid was still there, a silhouette of vengeance against the rising sun. She didn't wait for Oakes to stop her. She didn't wait for permission. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared. Through the scope, she saw Rashid's shoulder explode as the heavy round found its mark. He didn't die. He was knocked backward, disappearing into the rocks as his men scrambled to pull him to safety. The command structure of the ambush shattered in an instant. Without their leader's direction, the insurgents began to falter, their fire becoming ragged and uncoordinated. Oakes stood over her for a long second, his shadow long and dark. Then slowly he lowered his rifle. He sat down in the dirt next to her and pulled a spotting scope from his vest. "Range 1,200 yards, he said, his voice flat. "Wind 3 knots from the left. 2 insurgents moving on the mortar pit." Elena didn't ask questions. She didn't thank him. She just adjusted her aim. "Got M," she said. For the next 20 minutes they worked as a team, the captain who had dismissed her and the sergeant who had betrayed him, both of them fighting for the lives of the men below. Oaks called out the targets, and Elena took them down. They were a two-person island of resistance in a sea of chaos. When the first pair of A-10 warthogs finally screamed over the ridge, their Gatling guns chewing up the hillsides in a thunderous roar of BRRRT, Elena finally let out the breath she felt she'd been holding for a lifetime. The insurgents broke and ran, disappearing into the caves and crevices of the basin, as the air support turned the high ground into a graveyard of fire and smoke. The battle wasn't over, but the ambush was dead. Elena sat back against the cold stone, her rifle resting across her lap. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline draining out of her and leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion. She looked at Oaks, who was staring down at the convoy as the Marines began to regroup and treat their wounded. "You're still in a lot of trouble, Cruz," Oaks said, though there was no heat in his voice. "I know, sir. Barnes is going to want your head on a plate. You humiliated him. You were right and he was wrong, and a man like that doesn't forgive that kind of insult." "I know," she repeated. Oaks looked at her, his expression unreadable. "But you saved them. You saved every single one of them." Elena closed her eyes, the image of the blooming red desert finally fading. It didn't matter what happened next. It didn't matter if she was court-martialed, if she was stripped of her rank, or if she never held a rifle again. She had listened when no one else would. She had acted when everyone else was paralyzed by protocol. As the dust settled over the Karsa Basin, Sergeant Elena Cruz knew that she had finally found her value, and it wasn't behind a desk. The metallic taste of adrenaline and gun oil coated Elena's tongue as she pressed her cheek against the cold, unforgiving stock of her rifle. Below her, the valley was a cauldron of fire and screaming iron. She could practically hear Lieutenant Colonel Barnes's teeth grinding through the static of the radio, a visceral sound of a man pushed to his absolute limit. He was a man of protocol and rigid hierarchies, and Elena had just shattered every rule he lived by. Yet, as the dirt kicked up around the pinned-down convoy, the reality of survival began to override the friction of insubordination. She heard him relay the call for fire to higher headquarters, his voice tight with a mixture of professional poise and suppressed fury. Before the words could even clear the airwaves, another RPG streaked across the basin. It was a jagged line of white smoke and orange flame that missed the lead Humvee by mere inches, detonating against a nearby boulder with a bone-jarring crump. Elena didn't blink. She tracked the dissipating smoke trail back to its point of origin, finding a fighter partially obscured by a jagged outcropping. He was already fumbling with a fresh rocket, his movements frantic. Elena exhaled, a slow, controlled release of air, and squeezed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder and the fighter collapsed into the dust. But the victory was hollow. For every insurgent she silenced, two more seemed to crawl out from the shadows of the rocks. The convoy was attempting to adapt, the vehicles spreading out in a desperate search for cover amidst the barren, rocky terrain. Marines were spilling out of the armored doors, establishing fields of fire and working in synchronized teams. Their training was impeccable, a testament to months of drilling, but they were fighting from a hole. The insurgents held the high ground, the numerical advantage, and the element of surprise. This was a textbook kill box, and the walls were closing in. Elena's radio crackled again, the voice shift signaling a change in the command chain. Captain Oaks came through the line, his voice strained but steady. He told her that air support was 15 minutes out and artillery would need 20. He asked if she could maintain her position. 15 minutes. In a suburban living room, that was the length of a commercial break. Here, in the crosshairs of a coordinated ambush, 15 minutes was an eternity. It was a lifetime. Elena scanned the ridges, her eyes burning from the dust and the strain of constant focus. She counted targets, calculated distances, and then did the most terrifying math of all, her ammunition. She had maybe 60 rounds left in her kit. It wasn't enough, not even close. She told him she would maintain because what other choice was there? She couldn't tell him she was a ghost in the system, a soldier who had gone AWOL and scorched her own career to be here. She couldn't tell him that she was one woman standing against a tide of lead. She just adjusted her grip and kept shooting. A machine gun round punched through the boulder she was using for cover, just 6 inches from her temple. Rock fragments sprayed across her face like tiny, hot needles, drawing beads of blood, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't afford the luxury of a reaction. Her scope was already moving, drifting toward the eastern ridge. She found the shooter 240 meters away, tucked behind a stack of sandbags that looked suspiciously weathered. as if they had been placed there weeks ago in anticipation of this very slaughter. She fired, watching through the glass as the gunner's head snapped back. He vanished. The radio chirped again, Barnes's voice returning with a grim update. 3 vehicles were immobilized and the casualty count was rising. He asked for her ammunition status and Elena lied. She told him she had enough to keep shooting, even though the count was down to 40. The enemy felt like a hydra. Every time she cut down a threat, the desert seemed to provide a replacement. The planning on their part had been meticulous, a stark contrast to the intelligence reports that had dismissed the recent surge in radio chatter as local shepherds complaining about the weather. Below her, the scene was one of harrowing bravery. A Navy corpsman was dragging a wounded Marine across the open ground, his boots slipping on the loose shale, while another Marine stood over them, emptying magazines into the ridgeline to provide a few seconds of breathing room. An RPG screamed past them, the heat of its passage likely singeing their uniforms, before it slammed into a rock formation and rained shrapnel down upon the valley floor. Elena centered her crosshairs on the RPG team. The loader was exposed from the waist up, his hands busy with a fresh projectile. She took him first, watching him crumple into a heap. The shooter scrambled for cover, but Elena had already worked the bolt of her rifle. The spent brass pinged off the rocks beside her, a rhythmic, metallic music in the heart of the chaos. Her second shot caught the shooter mid-stride, dropping him before he could reach the safety of a deeper crevice. A new voice, younger and trembling with the weight of the moment, came over the net. He thanked her, telling her she had just saved his whole squad. Elena didn't have the breath to respond. A mortar team on the western ridge had finally found their range. The first few rounds had been long, but they were bracketing the convoy now with terrifying precision. 3 men were working the tube in a blurred dance of lethal efficiency, one dropping the rounds, one adjusting the sights, and one feeding the ammo. The distance was pushing 300 meters, and they were constantly shifting. It was a shot that would have been a challenge on a static range with a light breeze. Under the current conditions, with the world exploding around her, it was a miracle waiting to happen. Elena forced her heart rate down, sinking her world to the slow rise and fall of her chest. She tracked the gunner's movement, timing the rhythm of his reload. She anticipated where he would be in 2 seconds, held her breath, and let the round fly. He dropped like a stone. The remaining 2 members of the team scattered, but Elena was a machine of copper and lead. She caught the loader as he dove for a rock, the round spinning him around like a toy before he fell. The third man vanished into the shadows of the boulders. Air support was 10 minutes out, 300 seconds. Elena watched as a massive explosion tore through the center of the convoy. One of the immobilized Humvees had finally cooked off, its fuel and ammunition detonating in a spectacular, horrific fireball that licked at the morning sky. Black smoke roiled upward, a funeral shroud for whoever had been inside. Elena felt a cold knot of grief tighten in her chest, but she pushed it down. Emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. Emotion made your hands shake. Emotion got people killed. Movement caught her eye on the southern ridge. 5 insurgents were moving in a loose skirmish line, trying to flank the Marines. They were using the broken terrain with the skill of men who had lived in these mountains their entire lives. If they reached the overlook, they would be able to fire directly down into the defensive perimeter of the convoy. Elena engaged them rapidly. Precision took a backseat to volume as she worked to suppress their advance. Her first round found the lead fighter's chest, folding him instantly. The others dove for cover, but she stayed on them. She fired, missed, worked the bolt, and fired again. Another man went down, his body sliding several yards down the steep incline. The remaining 3 were smarter, disappearing into the crags. Elena swept her scope across the area, searching for a flash of fabric or the glint of a barrel, but the ridge was silent. Her radio crackled with the arrival of a heavy hitter. Devil Dog 6 announced that 2 Apaches were 8 minutes out. Danger close was authorized. The term danger close sent a shiver through the air. It meant the air support would be firing so close to the friendly positions that the risk of collateral damage was accepted as a necessity for survival. Barnes's voice came back, confirming the coordinates, but then he paused. He asked for her position. Elena rattled off her grid coordinates while simultaneously dropping a fighter who had peeked out to take a pot shot. She hit him in the leg, watching him tumble and scream as he tried to drag himself behind a rock. The command post acknowledged her position and told her to be ready to mark targets with tracers when the birds arrived. Elena looked at her remaining magazines. She didn't have a single tracer round. She had standard ball ammunition and 35 rounds left. She acknowledged the order anyway, knowing that if she admitted her status now, it might break the fragile morale of the men below. A fighter on the eastern ridge was playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek. He would pop up, fire a burst from his AK-47, and vanish before Elena could find him in the glass. It was classic shoot-and-scoot tactics. She stopped chasing him and started predicting him. She gambled that he would move 3 meters to his left for his next burst. She centered her scope on a patch of empty air and waited. A second later, the man rose into her crosshairs exactly as she'd imagined. Her shot took him in the throat, and he toppled backward into the abyss. A voice breathed a prayer over the radio, asking who the hell was up on that ridge. Barnes snapped at them to focus on their sectors, telling them to save the questions for later. The insurgent fire was reaching a crescendo. They knew the convoy was trapped. They knew the clock was ticking against them, and they were trying to finish the job before the sky fell on their heads. Elena spotted a new threat, 8 fighters moving through a wadi on the northern approach. The dry riverbed provided excellent concealment. If they made it to the flank, the Marines' defense would collapse like a house of cards. She engaged the lead fighter, dropping him in his tracks. The others pressed themselves against the wadi walls. They were trapped now. Retreat meant exposing themselves to her rifle, and advancing meant the same. Elena worked methodically, firing into the areas where she knew they were clustering. She couldn't see their faces, but she could see the dust kicked up by their boots. She forced them to stay low, pinning them in place with the sheer threat of her presence. Then one of them broke the script. He didn't hide. He didn't retreat. He charged forward, screaming a battle cry that was lost in the roar of the fight. He fired his AK one-handed while his other hand prepped a grenade. Elena's shot caught him mid-stride, but the momentum of his arm carried the grenade forward. It arced through the air, landing near a cluster of Marines who were using a wrecked vehicle for cover. The explosion was small but devastating. Elena saw 2 Marines collapse and others stagger, clutching their ears. The corpsman she had watched earlier was instantly on the move, rushing toward the new casualties without a thought for his own safety. An insurgent on the western ridge saw the corpsman, too. He rose, taking his time to aim at the medic. Elena saw the movement, saw the barrel leveling, saw the man's finger begin to curl. She fired a split second before he did. The insurgent's rifle discharged into the clouds as he fell away. The corpsman never even looked up. He was already elbow-deep in the work of saving lives. Then the sky began to throb. A new voice, calm and professional, identified himself as Viper 1-1. The Apache pilots had arrived. They reported that the situation looked hot and they were ready to make it hotter. Elena provided a rapid-fire brief: primary targets on the eastern and western ridges, secondary threat in the northern wadi. She estimated 30 combatants. The pilots acknowledged, and then the world changed. The Apaches came in low, the sound of their rotors a physical weight against the chest. The chin-mounted 30mm cannons began to cycle with a deep, rhythmic thrum that sounded like the earth itself was tearing apart. The first run stitched a line of fire across the eastern ridge, turning rock and sandbags into a fine red mist. The insurgents who had spent the last hour feeling like hunters were suddenly the prey. They broke from their positions, fleeing in a blind panic. Elena didn't stop. She used the chaos of the gun runs to pick off the runners. She was a scalpel following the sledgehammer of the Apaches. 3 more fighters fell to her rifle as they tried to escape the mechanical wrath from above. The second Apache rolled in on the western ridge, its cannon walking a line of destruction through the insurgent nests. Secondary explosions began to ripple across the hillside as ammunition stockpiles and RPG rounds cooked off in the heat. The sheer volume of insurgent fire plummeted. The coordination was gone. It was every man for himself now, but there was still a pocket of resistance. The mortar team on the southern ridge, the one group the Apaches hadn't reached yet, was frantically pivoting their tube. They weren't looking at the convoy anymore. They were looking at her. Elena felt the hair on her neck stand up. She rolled away from her primary firing position just as the first mortar round impacted the spot where she had been lying 3 seconds prior. The blast was deafening, a wall of pressure that threw her against the rocks and filled her vision with sparks. Dirt and shrapnel rained down on her. Her ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the roar of the battle. A second round landed 15 seconds later, further away but still searching for her. She keyed her radio, her voice rasping as she gave the coordinates of the mortar team to Viper 1-1. The pilot acknowledged, but Elena knew the math. The Apache was seconds away, and the mortar team was fast. She heard the thump of the tube again, the sound of high explosives arcing toward her. She pressed her body into the dirt, trying to become one with the stone. She prayed a silent, desperate prayer. The round hit 20 meters away. The concussion was a physical blow, and she felt a wave of heat wash over her skin. Sharp, jagged metal pinged off the rocks around her. A piece of shrapnel carved a hot, stinging line across her left shoulder, but she didn't even feel the pain yet. Then the Apache arrived. The ridge where the mortar had been was suddenly consumed by a sequence of 30 bursts, and the threat simply ceased to exist. Elena rolled back into a firing position, ignoring the blood that was starting to soak through her sleeve. She swept her scope over the valley. The fight was dying. The remaining insurgents were either dead or deep in the shadows, waiting for the cover of night to crawl away. She fired 2 more rounds at distant figures to keep them honest, then pulled back. She was down to 15 rounds. The radio announced that a quick reaction force was 12 minutes out, and medevac birds were already stacked in the air. Barnes's voice came back, sounding like a man who had been through the ringer. He reported heavy casualties and requested immediate surgical evacuation. That phrase, heavy casualties, sat in Elena's stomach like a lead weight. Marines had died today. She wondered if her actions had mitigated the loss or if she had simply arrived too late. The second guessing was a poison, but it was one she couldn't help but drink. Barnes came back on the line, his tone shifting from the heat of battle to the cold reality of command. He ordered her to stay put. He told her the QRF would secure her position and warned her not to try to extract on her own. It was a formal order, the verbal equivalent of a pair of handcuffs. The crisis was over, and the reckoning was beginning. Elena was no longer the guardian angel on the ridge. She was a sergeant who had broken a dozen different laws. She set her rifle down with a trembling hand. She cleared the chamber, engaged the safety, and slumped back against the boulder. The adrenaline was receding now, leaving a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She looked at the blood on her shoulder, a dark, wet patch against her tan uniform. It wasn't a lethal wound, just another piece of the mess she'd made of her life. She watched the Apaches circle, their presence a comforting and terrifying reminder of the power she had summoned. Below, the convoy was a wreck of smoke and twisted metal, but it was alive. Marines were moving, setting up a perimeter, and tending to their fallen. The first medevac helicopter was descending, its rotor wash creating a localized storm of dust. Soon the valley would be full of officers and investigators, people with clipboards and hard eyes who would want to know how a communications specialist had ended up on a ridge with a long-range rifle. The radio crackled one more time. It was Captain Oakes. He asked if she was still breathing. Elena managed a weak smile, the first bit of light she'd felt all day. She told him she was still here. He told her that he had a lot of questions, but then he added something that caught her off guard. He told her that she'd saved a lot of lives and that it would count for something. It was a small comfort, but she clung to it. She had traded her career for the lives of the men in that valley. It was a lopsided trade, and she would make it again every single time. The sound of the QRF's heavy transport helicopters began to fill the air, a rhythmic thumping that signaled the end of the engagement. A fire team began the long climb up to her position. Elena stood up slowly, her muscles protesting every movement. She kept her hands empty and visible. She knew how jittery soldiers could be after a fight. The lead man of the fire team reached her first, a staff sergeant named Martinez. He looked like he'd been dragged through a rock crusher. He looked at her rifle, then at her, and then down at the valley floor. He told her he'd been in the third vehicle, the one she'd protected from the RPG. He didn't yell. He didn't arrest her. He just reached out and shook her hand. He told her she was in a world of trouble, that Barnes was currently torn between a medal and a court-martial. Elena told him that both sounded about right. The Marines with Martinez didn't treat her like a prisoner. They offered her water and a field dressing for her shoulder. One of them, a young kid who looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last hour, told her she was lucky the shrapnel hadn't hit her subclavian artery. Elena just nodded, feeling the weight of that word, lucky. The descent from the ridge was a slow, painful process. Every step revealed a new scar on the landscape, piles of brass, scorched earth, the lingering scent of cordite. She saw the bodies of the insurgents she had taken down, grim reminders of the cost of the day. When she finally reached the valley floor, the atmosphere was a strange mix of relief and mourning. Marines she didn't know stopped what they were doing to watch her pass. Some nodded in respect, others looked away, perhaps uncomfortable with the breach of protocol she represented. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes was waiting by the command vehicle. He looked old. His uniform was shredded at the elbow, and he had a bandage wrapped around his forearm. He looked at Elena for a long time, his eyes searching hers for something. Regret maybe, or perhaps just a sign of the person who had been behind the scope. He told her she looked like hell. She told him it had been that kind of morning. He confirmed the casualty count. 1 Marine hadn't made it to the bird, 3 others were in critical condition. But then he told her about the reports coming in from the squad leaders. They were all saying the same thing. Her shooting had been the difference between a tactical withdrawal and a massacre. He told her he didn't know whether to shake her hand or throw her in the brig. Elena stayed silent. She knew there was no right answer to that dilemma. Barnes sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire operation. He told her she was under arrest pending a formal investigation. She would be confined to the base until they could figure out what to do with her. As he spoke, the last of the medevac birds lifted off, carrying the survivors towards safety. Elena watched it go, knowing that her journey was just beginning, and it was likely to be much lonelier than the one she'd just finished. The heat of the sun was now a physical weight, pressing down on the valley as the dust began to settle. The reality of the arrest felt strangely distant, a bureaucratic detail compared to the visceral memory of the scope and the trigger. She was escorted to a waiting transport, her movements stiff and mechanical. The Marines around her remained quiet, the usual banter of a unit replaced by a heavy, contemplative silence. They knew they were looking at a woman who had potentially ruined her life to save theirs, and that was a debt that was hard to put into words. As the vehicle began to crawl out of the basin, Elena looked out the back, watching the ridges where she had spent the last several hours. The desert looked the same as it always did, vast, indifferent, and ancient. It didn't care about orders or medals or the blood that had been spilled into its sand. It only knew the wind and the sun. Elena leaned her head against the vibrating metal of the transport and closed her eyes. For the first time since the first shot had been fired, she let herself breathe. Whatever came next, the hearings, the prison cell, the discharge, she knew she could face it. She had done what was necessary. She had held the line, and in the silence of the moving vehicle, that was enough. The air in the valley was thick with the scent of spent cordite and the heavy, metallic tang of blood, a smell that seemed to cling to the very dust motes dancing in the harsh Afghan sun. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes stood amidst the wreckage of what should have been a graveyard for 480 Marines, his eyes scanning the ridgeline where Elena had taken her stand. He was a man built of granite and regulation, but in that moment, the cracks in his professional veneer were showing. He looked at Sergeant Elena Cruz, really looked at her, seeing past the grime and the blood-soaked sleeve of her uniform. The silence between them stretched, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic thumping of a medevac helicopter banking toward the horizon. This entire situation is a disaster of bureaucratic proportions. Cruz, Barnes said, his voice low and gravelly, carrying the weight of a man who knew he was about to step into a political minefield. The events of today will be reviewed by officers far above my pay grade, and they'll be the ones to decide what happens next. They'll look at the data, the logs, and the bodies, and they'll try to fit it all into a neat little box that follows the rules. He paused, his gaze intensifying. "Yes, sir," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to drain from her system, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. Barnes continued to study her, his brow furrowed as if he were trying to solve a complex equation that didn't add up. "Why'd you do it, Cruz? And don't give me some canned line about duty or the sanctity of the mission. Don't give me the handbook answer. Why'd you really throw away your career like this? You knew the standing orders. You knew what Hicks would do to you." Elena didn't flinch. She met his eyes with a clarity that comes only after one has stared death in the face and refused to blink. "Because I was right, sir," she said, the words ringing with a quiet, undeniable conviction. "And because being right mattered more than being safe." A flicker of something unreadable passed across Barnes' face. It might have been a ghost of respect, a spark of anger at her defiance, or perhaps a weary recognition of the same fire he'd once felt in his own youth. "Get her back to the FOB, he finally snapped, turning to Staff Sergeant Martinez. "Make sure she sees a medic for that shoulder. And someone get me every piece of intelligence data from the last 72 hours. I want to know how the hell we missed this. I want every drone feed, every signal intercept, and every scout report on my desk by sunset." As Martinez began to lead her toward a waiting Humvee, Elena heard Barnes mutter under his breath, a sound almost lost to the wind. Being right mattered more than being safe. Jesus Christ, Cruz. You're either the bravest Marine I've ever met or the craziest. Maybe both. The words followed her as she climbed into the cramped, sweltering interior of the armored vehicle. The ride back to Forward Operating Base Alvarado was a journey through a landscape of oppressive silence. Elena sat in the back, squeezed between two MPs who had been tasked with her security. They weren't hostile, but they weren't friendly either. They were simply professional, their faces masks of military indifference as they performed a duty they likely didn't fully understand. Through the thick, dusty glass of the small window, Elena watched the Afghan countryside roll past in a blur of ochre and gray. Somewhere out in those jagged hills, Commander Rashid and whatever remained of his insurgent cell were retreating, licking their wounds and counting their dead. They had spent months planning this, cultivating the perfect trap, choosing the exact moment when the American convoy would be most vulnerable. They had expected a slaughter, a victory they could broadcast to the world. Instead, they had met a ghost in the rocks who knew their every move before they made it. She disrupted an entire campaign's worth of planning in less than an hour of sustained, precision shooting. That thought should have brought a sense of triumph, a surge of satisfaction. Instead, she just felt a profound, bone-deep tiredness that seemed to settle in her marrow. When the Humvee finally reached the perimeter of FOB Alvarado, the heavy steel gates groaned open, and Elena felt the weight of hundreds of eyes. Word had already spread through the base like a wildfire through dry brush. In a forward operating base of barely 300 Marines, news traveled faster than any radio signal or encrypted data burst. She was no longer just a communications specialist. She was the female sergeant who'd gone rogue. She was the woman who had turned a long-range rifle into a scalpel, cutting through an ambush at the cost of her own future. The MPs didn't take her to a holding cell, not yet. They escorted her directly to the medical tent, where the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and the low hum of portable air conditioners struggling against the desert heat. The base physician, a Navy lieutenant commander named Alvarez, looked up from a clipboard as they entered. He took one look at the blood crusting Elena's shoulder and shook his head, his expression a mix of professional concern and grim curiosity. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a galvanized steel exam table. He began to cut away the fabric of her uniform with practiced ease. "You're lucky this didn't sever anything major," he muttered as he inspected the wound. "Shrapnel or a mortar fragment by the looks of it. It's a clean tear, but it went deep. Could have been much worse. You'll have a scar to remember the day by, but full range of motion should return within 6 weeks if you don't do anything stupid." He paused, his hands steady as he applied a fresh dressing. "I heard what you did out there." Elena remained silent. She'd learned years ago that when the world was spinning out of control, silence was the only armor that truly held. If you didn't know what someone wanted to hear, it was better to give them nothing at all. Alvarez finished bandaging the shoulder and stepped back, wiping his hands on a towel. He didn't look away. "My cousin was in that convoy," he said softly. "Third vehicle. He's 22 years old, and this is his first deployment. He's got a kid back in San Diego he hasn't even met yet." He met her eyes, his gaze unwavering. "He's alive because of you. Whatever happens next, whatever the brass decides to do to you, I wanted you to know that. You saved a father today." "Thank you, sir," Elena whispered, the first crack appearing in her stoic mask. "Don't thank me yet," Alvarez warned, his voice regaining its clinical edge. "You've got a line of officers outside waiting to either tear you apart or pin medals on you. Knowing this command, it'll probably be both." He gestured toward the tent entrance. "Major Hicks is first in line, and he looks like he's ready to chew through a tank. Good luck, Sergeant. You're going to need it." Hicks didn't wait for an invitation. He entered the tent before Elena could even attempt to stand, his presence filling the small space with a palpable, vibrating fury. The operations officer looked exactly as she had feared, vindicated in his anger, ready to bury her under a mountain of regulations and protocol violations. He didn't sit down, and he didn't offer her the courtesy of pretending this was a conversation between equals. To him, she was a broken cog in a machine he spent his life trying to keep oiled. "Sergeant Cruz," he barked, his voice tight. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you have even the slightest inkling of the chaos you've unleashed?" "I saved 480 Marines from a coordinated ambush, sir." Elena replied, her voice level, echoing the same words she had rehearsed in her mind during the ride back. You violated direct orders from a lieutenant colonel. Hicks countered, stepping closer until he was looming over her. You stole government property, high-precision equipment you weren't even qualified to touch. You deserted your assigned post during active operations, leaving your team short-handed. You made command decisions that were not yours to make. You inserted yourself into a tactical situation without a shred of authorization, and you undermined the entire chain of command that keeps this corps functioning. His voice rose with every accusation, his face reddening. I also identified a legitimate high-level threat that our own intelligence analysis had completely missed, sir, Elena said. She knew she was digging her own grave, but she couldn't stop. The truth was the only thing she had left. Intelligence analysis that's conducted by trained specialists. Hicks shouted, his spit flecking his lips. People with security clearances you don't have, access to satellite imagery and signal intelligence you've never seen. You're a communications Sergeant Cruz. You're a technician who thinks she's some kind of tactical genius because she spends her spare time reading field manuals and playing with rifles. You got lucky today. That's all this was. A fluke. Luck. Luck doesn't account for 37 confirmed kills, sir, Elena said. The number hung in the humid air of the tent, heavy and cold. It was a staggering figure, a number that redefined the scale of her insubordination. Hicks' face went from red to a dangerous mottled purple. Those kills were unauthorized uses of deadly force in an operation you had no business being a part of. You took lives without a mandate, Sergeant. You played God in a valley that didn't belong to you. Those kills saved Marine lives, she insisted, her own anger finally beginning to simmer. That's not your determination to make. Ask the men in the third vehicle if my kills were unauthorized. Hicks slammed his hand down on the metal medical table, the sound like a gunshot. Instruments rattled and clattered to the floor. You don't get to decide when the orders don't apply to you. You don't get to play cowboy because you have a hunch. That's not how the military works. If we let people like you get away with this, the whole system collapses into anarchy. We aren't a collection of individuals, we are a unit, and you, Sergeant, have proven you are not part of that unit. Elena understood the subtext. It wasn't just about the orders. It was about who she was, enlisted female, a person who had seen the truth when the men in the air-conditioned rooms were blind. She had embarrassed him, and in the military, embarrassment was often a greater sin than failure. Is there anything else, sir? She asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Hicks stared at her, his chest heaving with barely contained rage. You're confined to quarters until the investigation is complete. You will not speak to anyone about this incident. You will not access any communications equipment. You will not leave your assigned tent except for meals and hygiene. Any violation of these restrictions, any attempt to contact the outside world or influence the witness statements will result in your immediate transfer to the brig. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. Good, because I am going to personally ensure that this investigation results in the maximum possible punishment. You may have fooled some people today with your heroics, Cruz, but I see exactly what you are. You're a glory hound, someone who thinks the rules are for the little people. He turned toward the exit, pausing only to throw one last barb over his shoulder. Enjoy your last few days as a Marine. They are very much numbered. Once the flap of the tent settled, Alvarez returned from the shadows where he had been waiting. He handed Elena a bottle of water, his expression sympathetic but weary. That went about as well as expected, he remarked. He's not wrong about the violation, sir, Elena said, taking a slow sip of the water. Her throat felt like it was filled with sand. No, he's not, but he's also a man who's never been shot at in his life. He wouldn't last 30 seconds in actual combat without a manual to tell him which way to point the rifle. Alvarez pulled out a penlight and checked her pupil dilation. Any dizziness, nausea, headaches? No, sir, just tired. You will be. The adrenaline crash is going to hit you like a freight train. When it does, drink as much water as you can and try to sleep. Your body just went through hell and your brain isn't far behind. He made a few final notes on her chart, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet tent. The MPs will take you to your quarters now. Follow their instructions and for the love of God, try not to piss anyone else off today. The walk back to her tent felt like a perp walk. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the gravel paths of the FOB. Marines stopped what they were doing to watch her pass. Some of the faces showed a raw, undeniable respect, nods from grunts who knew exactly what she'd prevented. Others showed contempt, seeing her as a traitor to the discipline they lived by. Most, however, just looked confused. They didn't know whether to cheer or look away. Elena kept her eyes locked forward, her chin up, refusing to let the weight of their judgment bow her head. Rodriguez was waiting outside their shared tent. The moment she saw Elena, she rushed forward, her face a mask of terror and relief. She pulled Elena into a fierce, desperate hug that made Elena's injured shoulder scream in protest. Elena winced, a sharp intake of breath escaping her. "You crazy, beautiful idiot," Rodriguez whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought you were dead. When I heard you'd gone over the wire, I thought I'd sent you off to die alone. I thought I'd have to live with that for the rest of my life." "I'm not dead," Elena said, gently disengaging from the hug. "No, but your career might be," Rodriguez said, her eyes scanning Elena for injuries. She stopped at the blood-stained bandage. "Your shoulder, it's bad. It's fine, just a scratch. Alvarez patched it up." "Bullshit, you're bleeding through the dressing already. You need to lie down." Rodriguez guided her into the dim interior of the tent and made her sit on her rack. The familiar surroundings, the smell of laundry, the small stack of books, the photo of her parents, felt strange now, like remnants of a life that belonged to someone else. "I'm going back to get Alvarez. He already cleared me, Rodriguez. I'm fine, really." "You're not fine. You're running on fumes and denial." Rodriguez sat on the footlocker beside her. "The whole base is talking. They're saying you killed almost 40 insurgents by yourself. They're saying you were like a ghost in the hills." 37 confirmed. Could be more," Elena said, the number feeling more real now, more horrifying. Rodriguez just stared at her, her mouth slightly agape. "Jesus Christ, Elena, 37. That's more than most sniper teams see in a whole tour." "They were going to kill everyone, Rodriguez. The whole convoy. It was a perfect ambush, a kill box designed to leave no survivors. And no one would listen. I told them, I showed them the data, and they laughed at me." Elena felt the exhaustion pulling at her like a physical weight, a gravity she could no longer fight. "I couldn't just sit there and watch it happen. I couldn't listen to the radio and hear them die. So you threw away everything. Your career, your future, everything you've worked for since you were 18. "What future?" The words came out more bitter than Elena intended. "I've been trying to get into sniper school for 2 years. 2 years of requests denied, of being told I'm more valuable in communications, of watching guys who can barely hit a stationary target get slots while I'm stuck behind a desk. Today proved I can do the job. Today proved I'm better than most of the people they've already sent to school. Today proved you're willing to disobey orders," Rodriguez countered gently. "In their eyes, that makes you a liability, not an asset. Today proved I was right when everyone else was wrong," Elena snapped. "And if the Corps can't handle that, then maybe I don't want to be a part of it anymore." Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the distant hum of the base generators. "You know what the crazy part is? I heard Hicks screaming at you from 3 tents away. He wants your head on a platter. But I also heard what the Marines from the convoy are saying. They're calling you a hero, Elena. They're saying you're the only reason they're coming home." "Heroes follow orders," Elena said hollowly. "I'm just a sergeant who committed multiple violations of the UCMJ. I'm a criminal with a good aim." "You're a sergeant who saw something no one else saw and had the courage to act on it," Rodriguez said, reaching out to squeeze Elena's hand. "That has to count for something. It has to." A sharp knock on the wooden tent frame interrupted them. Captain Oak stood at the entrance, his expression unreadable in the twilight. He was a man known for his calm, someone who moved through the chaos of the FOB with a quiet authority. "Sergeant Cruz, we need to talk." Rodriguez stood immediately, her posture stiffening. "I'll give you two some privacy, sir." "Stay, Lance Corporal," Oak said, stepping into the tent. The small space suddenly felt much smaller. "This concerns you too. You were the one who helped her, weren't you?" Rodriguez didn't answer, but her silence was an admission. Oak sat on her footlocker, looking tired. "Sergeant Cruz, I'm here in an unofficial capacity. Anything said in this conversation is off the record." "Understood." "Yes, sir," Elena said, trying to sit up straighter. "Major Hicks wants your head on a pike." Oaks began, confirming what she already knew. "He's already drafted charges recommending a general court-martial for desertion, theft of government property, and failure to obey a lawful order. If he gets his way, you're looking at a dishonorable discharge and serious prison time at Leavenworth." Elena felt her stomach drop, a cold pit of dread opening up. "I understand, sir. However," Oaks held up a hand, "Lieutenant Colonel Barnes is writing a different report. His version is more nuanced. He emphasizes that you identified a legitimate threat through proper intelligence analysis. that you attempted to report it through the correct channels multiple times, and that when those channels failed, you took decisive action that saved approximately 450 Marines' lives. 450. Elena had the count of 480 in her head. We had 30 casualties, Oakes said, his voice hardening. 14 wounded who will recover, 13 critical who might not make the night, and 3 dead before the medevac even arrived. The numbers hit Elena like physical blows. 3 dead, 13 fighting for their lives. She had been there, she had been shooting, she had been doing everything in her power, and it still hadn't been enough. The 3 who died, sir, do you know who they were? I'm not giving you their names, Cruz. That's not your burden to carry, Oakes said firmly. What you need to understand is that you're at the center of a political shitstorm. Hicks represents one faction, officers who believe discipline and order are the only things keeping us from being savages, who think letting you off sets a dangerous precedent that will destroy the Corps. Barnes represents another, combat officers who care about results and protecting their men at any cost. And you, sir, which faction do you represent? Oakes smiled grimly, a flicker of dark humor in his eyes. I represent the faction that thinks you're both a hero and a complete idiot, and I'm not sure which one matters more yet. I'm the guy who has to make sure this base doesn't tear itself apart while the colonels fight it out. He stood up, the light from the tent's single bulb casting his face in sharp relief. The investigation will take at least 72 hours. During that time, you are confined to this tent. Use that time to get your story straight because you're going to have to tell it a lot. To investigators, to lawyers, and eventually to a board of officers. And Cruz, he added, pausing at the exit. Sir, when you tell it, stick to the facts. Don't embellish, don't try to justify it with emotion, and don't make excuses. What you did either stands on its own merit or it doesn't. There's no middle ground here. Yes, sir. After Oakes left, Elena lay back on her rack and stared at the olive-drab ceiling of the tent. The 3 Marines who had died. Their faces haunted her even though she didn't know their names. Had she triggered the ambush too early? If she had waited another minute, would they have been in better cover, or would everyone have died? The mathematics of violence were impossible to calculate. For every action, there were 1,000 potential outcomes, 1,000 ghosts waiting to be born. Change one variable and the whole world shifted. You need to sleep, Rodriguez said from the shadows. I can't. Try anyway, your body needs to recover. But sleep felt like an impossibility. Every time Elena closed her eyes, she was back on that ridge. She saw the convoy getting hit, saw the flashes of the RPGs, saw the Marine falling in the 3rd vehicle, the doctor's cousin. She saw the face of the fighter she had killed half a second too late to save someone. 37 confirmed kills. That number would stay with her forever, a weight she would carry into every room for the rest of her life. 37 human beings who had woken up that morning and decided to kill, and who were now gone because she was faster. She had killed before 3 times in her career, all in situations where the rules of engagement were clear and the threat was immediate. Each of those moments had kept her awake for days afterward, replaying the scenario, questioning her soul. But 37, that was a body count that changed the chemistry of your blood. Rodriguez, Elena whispered into the dark. Yeah, do you think I did the right thing? There was a long silence, the kind that felt heavy with the weight of the world. I think you did the only thing you could live with, Rodriguez finally said. Whether it was right or wrong in the eyes of the law, I don't know. But I know you saved a lot of families a lot of pain today. That has to count for something. The next 72 hours crawled past like decades. Elena was interviewed 6 times by 3 different investigating officers, each one bringing a different energy to the room. Some were cold and accusatory, asking variations of the same questions. Why did you disobey a direct order? What made you think your analysis was superior to a dedicated intelligence cell? Did you consider the long-term consequences of your insubordination? She followed Oakes' advice. She stuck to the facts. She laid out exactly what she had seen in the data, the patterns of movement, the anomalies in the local radio traffic, the specific geographic advantages of the basin. She described her actions with clinical precision, omitting the fear and the desperation. She watched their faces. Some seemed sympathetic, their eyes softening when she described the moment the first RPG was fired. Others remained convinced she was a loose cannon, a danger to the very institution she claimed to serve. None of them gave her any indication of which way the scales were tipping. On the 2nd day of her confinement, Corporal Matthews visited the tent. He stood at the entrance, looking profoundly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot as if he were standing on hot coals. "Can I come in, Sergeant?" "It's a free country, Matthews," sort of, Elena said, sitting up on her rack. Matthews entered but refused to sit. He looked at his boots for a long moment before finally meeting her eyes. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "for what I said before the convoy left. About you reading spy novels and wasting your time, about you being emotional. You were following the official intelligence assessment, Matthews. That was your job." "I was being a dismissive prick because I didn't want to consider that you might be right," Matthews countered. "My brother was in that convoy, 4th vehicle. He's 20 years old and this is his first combat deployment. He's alive because you didn't listen to people like me. He's alive because you had the balls to be wrong according to the rules." Elena didn't know what to say. The guilt she felt was still a sharp, jagged thing in her chest. "Matthews, I gave a statement to the investigation," he continued, cutting her off. "I told them you came to me first with your concerns. I told them I dismissed you without proper consideration. I told them that if I'd taken you seriously and reported your analysis up the chain, maybe the convoy could have been rerouted. Maybe those 3 guys would still be here." He looked away, his jaw tight. "That's on me, not you." He turned to leave, then paused at the flap. "For what it's worth, Sergeant, I hope they let you stay in. The Corps needs more people who are willing to be right even when it costs them everything." After he left, Rodriguez whistled low. "Well, that was unexpected. Matthews is usually about as flexible as a brick." "People surprise you sometimes," Elena said, feeling a strange warmth in her chest. "Speaking of surprises, you've got another group of visitors," Rodriguez said, looking outside. Elena looked up to see Staff Sergeant Martinez at the entrance, accompanied by 2 other Marines she recognized from the convoy, a corporal and a lance corporal. They looked serious, their faces set in grim determination. "Sergeant Cruz," Martinez said, entering without asking for permission. "Got a minute?" "I've got nothing but minutes right now, Staff Sergeant." The 3 Marines arranged themselves in the limited space of the tent, their presence feeling like a protective barrier. "We wanted you to know something," Martinez began. "The Marines from the convoy were putting together a statement, a collective testimony about what happened out there. We're detailing how your actions directly saved lives. We've got specific instances where your shooting prevented us from being overrun." The corporal spoke up, his voice steady. "I was the one you heard on the radio, Sergeant, the one screaming about the RPG team on the North Ridge. You took them out before they could fire a second shot. They had us dead to rights. We were pinned down and they had the perfect angle. Your first shot gave us the 3 seconds we needed to find cover. My whole squad is here because of those 3 seconds." The lance corporal added, "I'm the corpsman you saw, the one running to the wounded in the middle of the kill box. I didn't know it at the time, but I watched the video footage from the Apache later. You shot an insurgent who had me zeroed. He was in a window maybe 50 yards away. He had me lined up perfect, and you dropped him half a second before he pulled the trigger." Elena felt her throat tighten, a lump forming that she couldn't swallow. "You don't need to do this. You're going to get yourselves in trouble with Hicks." "Yeah, we do," Martinez said, leaning forward. "Because Major Hicks is trying to bury you, and we're not going to sit back and let that happen. You saved our lives, Sergeant. Some of us owe you everything we are. The least we can do is tell the truth about what happened on that road." "The truth is I violated orders," Elena whispered. "The truth is you were right and you acted on it," the corporal insisted. "Everything else is just politics and ass-covering by people who don't want to admit they missed a threat. We're Marines, Cruz, we take care of our own." They stayed for another 20 minutes, sharing stories from the ambush, filling in the terrifying details that Elena hadn't been able to see through her scope. They talked about the Marine whose life she'd saved by neutralizing a mortar team before they could find their range. They talked about the squad that had been seconds from being overrun when her precision fire broke the enemy's momentum. Each story was both a weight and a relief. It was a weight because it drove home how close they had all come to total annihilation, and a relief because it confirmed that her gamble had been worth it. Her actions hadn't just been insubordination, they had been a lifeline. After they left, the tent felt incredibly quiet. Rodriguez didn't push her to talk, she just sat nearby, a silent presence that anchored Elena to the world. "What if they are wrong, Rodriguez?" Elena asked after a long time. "What if I just got lucky and I've convinced everyone it was skill? What if I'm as dangerous as Hicks says I am?" "You don't kill 37 people with luck, Elena," Rodriguez said firmly. "You do it with years of training, a gift for observation, and ice in your veins. You were built for this." Everyone knew it except the people who were too busy looking at your rank and your gender to see the warrior underneath. Ice in my veins. Elena managed a small, tired smile. That's supposed to be a compliment. From a sniper, it's the highest praise there is. Rodriguez smiled back. I think you've been ready for sniper school since the day you stepped onto this FOB. And I think the only reason they didn't send you was because they were afraid you'd be better than them. On the morning of the third day, the summons finally came. 2 MPs arrived at the tent, their expressions more formal than before. Sergeant Cruz, you are required at the base commander's office. Immediately. Elena stood, smoothed her uniform, and checked her reflection in a small, cracked mirror. She looked pale, the dark circles under her eyes vivid, but her gaze was steady. She walked out of the tent, flanked by the MPs, and felt the entire base hold its breath. Colonel Hendricks' office was at the far end of the command center, a space that smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco. Hendricks was a career infantry officer with 30 years of service, a man who had seen the best and worst of the Marine Corps. He was known for a sense of fairness that was often tempered with a zero-tolerance policy for incompetence. When Elena entered, he was sitting behind a heavy wooden desk, reviewing a thick stack of files. He didn't look up for a full minute, leaving Elena standing at attention, her injured shoulder throbbing in time with her heartbeat. Finally, he closed the folder and looked up. His expression was a mask of professional neutrality. Sergeant Cruz, do you know why the Marine Corps has a chain of command? To ensure organized execution of orders and maintain unit cohesion, sir, she replied, her voice echoing in the small room. To prevent chaos, Hendricks corrected, his voice surprisingly soft. To ensure that when the bullets start flying, everyone knows their role and follows it without question. Because hesitation kills. Confusion kills, freelancing kills. When one person decides they know better than the plan, the entire structure begins to crumble. Yes, sir. You freelanced, Sergeant. You saw a situation, decided you knew better than your superiors, and took unilateral action that put yourself and your equipment at risk. Hendricks stood up and walked around the desk, his presence imposing. Under normal circumstances, that level of insubordination would end your career. You'd be lucky to leave this base with anything other than a dishonorable discharge and a prison sentence. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face a mask of granite. I understand, sir. However, Hendricks said, pausing in front of her, these are not normal circumstances. I have spent the last 48 hours reviewing every piece of evidence. I've read the intelligence reports you flagged. I've watched the drone footage from the ambush. I've listened to the statements of the men you saved. He paced back to his desk. The investigation has concluded that your tactical assessment was, in fact, entirely correct. You identified a legitimate threat that our specialized cells missed. Your subsequent actions directly prevented what would have been a catastrophic loss of life. Hope flared in Elena's chest, a sudden, sharp heat. The investigation has also concluded that there were significant failures in our own intelligence processing. Hendricks continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. That your warnings were dismissed without proper consideration. That institutional bias played a role in how your analysis was received. It seems some of my officers were more concerned with who was delivering the message than the message itself. He sat back down, leaning over the files. I am recommending that the most serious charges be dropped. You will not face a court-martial. Elena felt a wave of relief so powerful it made her knees weak. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Hendricks snapped. You will receive a formal reprimand for unauthorized use of government property and failure to follow proper channels for reporting intelligence concerns. This reprimand will remain in your permanent file. It will likely prevent you from ever reaching the rank of staff sergeant. It is a black mark that will follow you for the rest of your career. He paused, looking at her with an expression that was almost like a challenge. But there is a secondary recommendation. Given your demonstrated proficiency with long-range systems and your ability to operate under extreme pressure, I am authorizing your immediate transfer to the Scout Sniper Basic Course at Quantico. If you pass, and that is a very large if, you will be reassigned as a designated marksman. Elena blinked, the words sinking in. It was everything she had wanted, handed to her in the same breath as a reprimand that would haunt her. It was a second chance wrapped in a warning. Major Hicks is understandably livid, Hendricks added, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He believes I'm rewarding bad behavior, but I believe in results, Sergeant. You saved 450 Marines. That earns you a seat at the table. Whether you keep that seat is entirely up to you. "I won't let you down, sir," Elena said, her voice thick with newfound resolve. "See that you don't. You've become a symbol on this base, Cruz. For some, you're a hero. For others, you're a warning. Make sure you're the right kind of symbol from here on out." He gestured toward the door. Dismissed. Elena stepped out into the bright Afghan sun, the heat no longer feeling oppressive but like a forge. She saw Rodriguez waiting near the command center, and for the first time in days, Elena let herself smile. The road ahead would be brutal, filled with people like Hicks who would wait for her to fail, but she had the ice in her veins and the ghosts of 3 Marines to keep her focused. She hadn't just survived the ambush, she had survived the system, and now she was finally going to become the warrior she was meant to be. The air in Lieutenant Colonel Hendricks' office was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the hum of an aging air conditioning unit that struggled against the oppressive Afghan heat outside. For Elena, the world seemed to have narrowed down to the singular, terrifying point of the officer's gaze. When he finally spoke the words, telling her that the formal reprimand would stay on her permanent record, the initial wave of relief was so violent it made her knees weak. It wasn't the end. She wasn't being stripped of her rank or sent to a military prison. But before she could even draw a full breath of that relief, Hendricks continued, and the second half of his sentence landed with the heavy, bone-jarring force of a sledgehammer. He was recommending her for an immediate transfer to Scout Sniper School. Elena's mind went momentarily blank, the silence in the room suddenly ringing in her ears like the aftershock of a nearby explosion. She heard her own voice, faint and questioning, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. She asked for clarification, her brain unable to bridge the gap between the disciplinary action she had expected and the elite opportunity she was being offered. Hendricks didn't blink. He laid out the reality of the situation with the cold, clinical precision of a man who had spent his life weighing the value of human assets. He spoke of her marksmanship, not just as a skill, but as an expert-level performance executed under the most harrowing combat conditions imaginable. He mentioned her tactical decision-making, noting that while it had bypassed every standard operating procedure in the book, it had undeniably saved hundreds of American lives. To Hendricks and to the Marine Corps, she had proven she possessed the rare ability to operate independently in environments where the stress was high enough to break most seasoned veterans. The colonel pulled a secondary file from his desk, the paper crisp and white against the dark wood. He explained that her previous applications for the sniper program had been discarded, buried under concerns about her temperament and her perceived inability to follow the rigid structure of the chain of command. The events of the past few days had, in a sense, validated those concerns. She had gone rogue. She had ignored orders, but she had also performed at a level so elite that it could no longer be ignored. Elena struggled to reconcile the two halves of the conversation. She felt as though she were being punished and promoted in the same breath, a paradox that made her head spin. Hendricks met her eyes with a look of hard-won wisdom. He admitted that the Marine Corps was an imperfect institution, one that often overlooked raw talent because it didn't fit into a pre-established mold. By her actions, Elena had forced them to confront that failure. Now they were correcting it, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. As the weight of the moment settled over her, Elena felt the hot prickle of tears threatening to surface. She fought them back with everything she had, refusing to show that vulnerability in front of the man who held her career in his hands. She managed a whispered thank you, but Hendricks was quick to temper her excitement. He reminded her that the Scout Sniper School wasn't a reward, it was a gauntlet. With a 70% attrition rate, the school was designed to break people. One successful engagement in a valley didn't mean she would survive the training pipeline. She could still wash out, returning to the regular infantry with a permanent mark on her record and the sting of failure on her soul. Elena's response was immediate and fueled by the same stubborn fire that had led her to pick up that rifle in the first place. She told him she wouldn't wash out. A ghost of a smile touched Hendricks' lips, the first sign of humanity she had seen from him all afternoon. He dismissed her, giving her 48 hours to pack her life and prepare for the transition. Walking out of that office felt like stepping into a different reality. The military police officers who had escorted her in as a potential criminal were now smiling, their posture relaxed. One of them offered a quiet word of congratulations, but Elena barely heard him. Her mind was a whirlwind of impossibility. She had been reprimanded and reborn in the span of 10 minutes. Outside the command building, the sun was a blinding disk in the sky, and Rodriguez was there, pacing the gravel like a caged predator. The moment she saw Elena, she didn't wait for a report. She rushed forward, her eyes searching Elena's face for the verdict. When Elena told her about the reprimand followed by the transfer to sniper school, Rodriguez froze. She made Elena repeat the second part, her jaw dropping in genuine shock. Then, she let out a laugh that echoed off the plywood walls of the surrounding buildings, pulling Elena into a fierce hug. Elena winced as her healing shoulder protested the sudden pressure, but she didn't pull away. Rodriguez had been the only one who believed she could survive this, and the victory belonged to both of them. The reality of the timeline began to sink in as they walked back toward their living quarters. 48 hours. It seemed like an eternity and a heartbeat all at once. In 2 days, she would have to pack up 11 months of memories, dust, and blood at FOB Alvarado. She would have to say goodbye to the small circle of people she had come to trust in this desolate corner of the world. She was headed for Camp Lejeune, 8,000 miles away from the jagged peaks of the Afghan mountains. It was a journey from the dry, thin air of a war zone to the thick, humid forests of North Carolina. She knew she would be starting from zero, walking into a hornet's nest of instructors who had likely already heard the rumors of the female sergeant who had defied her officers and lived to tell the tale. Rodriguez noticed the distant look in Elena's eyes and told her she was overthinking. She pushed for a celebration, even if it was just with near beer in a dry, forward operating base. Elena wasn't in the mood for festivities. The gravity of what lay ahead was already beginning to anchor her spirit. But Rodriguez wouldn't hear of it. She argued that the Marines Elena had saved needed to see her. They needed more than just a name in an official report. They needed to look the person who had given them back their lives in the eye. It was about closure, not just for them, but for Elena too. An hour later, Elena found herself standing at the entrance of the Chow Hall, and the sheer volume of the reaction nearly knocked her back. The room was packed, and as she stepped inside, the sound of hundreds of palms hitting together erupted like a roll of thunder. It was overwhelming. Staff Sergeant Martinez appeared at her side, his presence a steadying force as he guided her through the sea of camouflage and sun-baked faces. For the next 2 hours, Elena shook more hands than she thought possible. She listened to stories from the ambush that she hadn't been able to see from her perch on the ridge. She met the vehicle commander who had been seconds away from being vaporized by an RPG before her bullet found the insurgent's brain. She spoke with a machine gunner who had been pinned down, certain he was breathing his last breaths, until the fire from above suddenly cleared a path for his escape. There was a young private, his eyes still wide with the shock of combat, who told her he had watched her first shot through his own rifle scope. He said that in that moment, seeing the precision of her fire, he realized they weren't alone. Each conversation was a revelation. Elena began to see the ripples of her actions, the way a single decision had branched out to save brothers, sons, and fathers. She wasn't just a marksman who had cleared a kill zone. She was the reason these men would eventually go home to their families. As the crowd finally began to thin, Lieutenant Colonel Barnes approached. Without the tactical gear and the frantic energy of the command center, he looked older, the deep lines in his face carved by years of carrying the weight of men's lives on his shoulders. He asked her to walk with him, and they stepped out into the cooling evening air of the perimeter. Barnes was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the darkening silhouettes of the mountains that ringed the base. He spoke of his 23 years in the Corps, of the courage and sacrifice he had witnessed across multiple continents. But what Elena had done, he said, was something different. It was a moment of absolute clarity and terrifying risk. He didn't sugarcoat the situation. He told her plainly that if she had been wrong, if her instincts had failed her, or if the ambush had been a ghost, she would be in a brig right now, and he would have been the one signing the papers to end her life as a free woman. He challenged her to truly understand the razor-thin margin between her current success and a total, disgraceful collapse. He saw in her an absolute certainty that was both her greatest strength and her most dangerous flaw. Before they parted, Barnes handed her an envelope. It was a letter of recommendation for the sniper school, written in his precise, mechanical hand. He told her not to thank him, but to ensure that his faith in her wasn't misplaced. He had stuck his neck out for her, and now it was her responsibility to make sure the instructors at Lejeune knew exactly what kind of Marine they were dealing with. Elena stood in the darkness after he left, reading the letter by the glow of a flashlight. The words were powerful, documenting 37 confirmed kills and a level of tactical independence that Barnes claimed exceeded any Marine he had seen in over 2 decades. It was more than just a letter. It was a shield she would carry into the coming storm. The final 2 days were a blur of motion. Every piece of gear she owned was cleaned, inventoried, and packed. The knot of anxiety in her stomach grew with every hour that passed. She knew the legends of Scout Sniper School, how they sought out the tiniest crack in a person's psyche and hammered at it until the whole foundation crumbled. On her last night, she stood on the perimeter wall, watching the sun dip behind the mountains one last time. Rodriguez joined her, bringing a simple offering of water and cookies from a care package. They sat in the fading light, talking about the future and the past. Rodriguez admitted she would miss the friction Elena caused, the way she refused to back down from anyone, regardless of rank. She also spoke of the loneliness of being the only woman left in their section, a reality that Elena hadn't fully considered until that moment. Rodriguez made her promise to remember Coast Basin when the instructors tried to break her. She told Elena that she had already proven she belonged in that elite circle, and that she shouldn't let anyone's preconceived notions make her forget her own worth. They stayed there until the stars began to poke through the vast, dark canopy of the Afghan sky, sharing a quiet bond that didn't need many words. The next morning, the roar of a transport helicopter signaled the end of her time at Alvarado. Elena boarded with her sea bag and her rifle case, looking down at the base as it shrank into a tiny, dusty speck in the vastness of the desert. The flight to Bagram was 3 hours of reflection, a mental inventory of everything she knew and everything she was about to learn. The transit through Bagram was a lesson in the scale of the military machine. She was just one of thousands of souls moving through the hub, yet the weight of her specific destination felt like a physical burden. During a 6-hour layover, she was summoned to a communications office where a master sergeant handed her a satellite phone. On the other end was the voice of Gunnery Sergeant Walker, the senior instructor at the school. His voice was like grinding stones, filled with an authority that didn't need to shout to be felt. He told her he had read her file. He acknowledged the 37 kills but dismissed them as potentially nothing more than luck. He was cold, professional, and clearly skeptical. He didn't care about the headlines or the lives she had saved. He only cared about whether she could meet the standard of the school. He warned her not to expect special treatment and told her to report to Building 52 at Camp Jiger at 0600 on Monday. The line went dead before she could even say, "I, Gunny." The journey across the Atlantic was a marathon of restless sleep and recycled airplane air. When she finally arrived in North Carolina, the change was jarring. The world was vibrant and green, the air heavy with a humidity that made her skin feel damp the moment she stepped off the bus. The smell of pine trees and damp earth was a shock to a system that had grown accustomed to the scent of burning trash and dry dust. She arrived at the barracks at 0530, the first student to show up. She moved with mechanical precision, claiming a bunk and stowing her gear before taking her place outside Building 52. As the other candidates arrived, the atmosphere shifted. They were all men, and the looks they threw her way were a mix of curiosity and blatant resentment. She was a ghost story to them, a rumor made flesh. At exactly 0600, Gunnery Sergeant Walker emerged. He was a compact man, built with the dense musculature of a career grunt, his eyes sharp and unforgiving. He called the formation to order and immediately singled Elena out, bringing her to the front. He spoke to the class, acknowledging her record but framing it as a display of indiscipline rather than heroism. He made it clear to everyone standing there that the school didn't care about her gender or her fame. If she failed, it would be because she wasn't good enough, and if she succeeded, it would be because she had survived the same hell as everyone else. The first day was an onslaught of administrative hurdles and physical assessments. Elena pushed her body to the limit, her lungs burning in the thick North Carolina air. She maxed out the fitness tests, proving her physical readiness, but she knew that the physical part was only the entry fee. The real test would be mental. That evening, as she tried to navigate the social minefield of the barracks, she was confronted by a group of male candidates led by a corporal named Dietrich. He was a large, imposing man who didn't hide his disdain. He told her to her face that she was a diversity hire, a publicity stunt for a Marine Corps looking to look good in the press. He predicted she would wash out within a week, just like the few women who had come before her. Elena didn't raise her voice. She didn't get angry. She simply looked him in the eye and told him that they would see who was still standing in 13 weeks. She pushed past him, but when she reached her rack, she found it had been ransacked. Her gear was strewn across the floor, her personal items tossed aside with deliberate disrespect. It was a classic tactic, a way to tell her she wasn't wanted. She began to clean up the mess with a calm, practiced patience. It was then that Sergeant Morrison, a veteran with the hard eyes of someone who had seen real combat, approached her. He offered a hand and a word of genuine respect. He told her that not everyone in the class felt like Dietrich, but he warned her that the instructors and the skeptics would be watching her every move, waiting for the slightest stumble. Elena thanked him, her mind already shifting to the next morning. The first field exercise was a 5-mile movement under full pack, followed by a stalking drill. It was meant to weed out the weak early. As she lay in her bunk that night, the air in the barracks filled with the snores of 30 men, Elena stared at the ceiling. She thought of the mountains in Afghanistan, the weight of the rifle in her hands, and the promise she had made to herself and to Rodriguez. She wasn't here to represent her gender or to prove a point to the media. She was here because she was a predator, a guardian, and a Marine. The hunt was about to begin, and she was ready to disappear into the woods of North Carolina and show them exactly what she was capable of. The 5-mile movement began before the sun had even cleared the horizon. The humidity of the coastal woods felt like a wet wool blanket draped over the candidates' shoulders. Each Marine carried a full combat load, the heavy packs cutting into their shoulders as they moved at a pace that was just short of a run. Elena kept her pace steady, her breathing rhythmic. She didn't try to lead the pack, nor did she fall to the rear. She stayed in the middle, a silent shadow moving through the flickering light of the forest. Beside her, she could hear the labored breathing of some of the men who had underestimated the toll the humidity would take on their stamina. Dietrich was near the front, throwing glances back at her, his face a mask of exertion. The weight of the pack was a familiar burden, but the terrain was new. Instead of the jagged rocks and loose shale of the Hindu Kush, she was navigating tangled roots, soft mud, and thick underbrush that seemed to reach out and grab at her gear. Every muscle in her legs burned, the lactic acid building with every incline. She focused on the back of the man in front of her, turning her mind into a blank slate, a trick she had learned during long Overwatch missions. When they finally reached the designated endpoint, the candidates were given a 5-minute break, just enough time to gulp down some water and adjust their boots before the stalking drill began. Gunnery Sergeant Walker stood at the edge of a clearing, his clipboard in hand. The instructors had set up a pair of observers with high-powered binoculars in a concealed position 200 yards away. The goal was simple but incredibly difficult. Move through the vegetation, get within 200 yards of the target, and fire 2 blank rounds without being spotted. If an observer saw a flash of skin, a shimmer of a lens, or the unnatural movement of a branch, the candidate was out. Elena took a deep breath, the scent of pine and damp earth filling her lungs. She began her approach, dropping to her stomach and moving with agonizing slowness. She used the natural contours of the land, sliding through the tall grass like a serpent. She was acutely aware of the noise she was making, the slight rustle of a leaf, the snap of a tiny twig. In the sniper world, silence wasn't just a preference, it was life. She watched the observers, timing her movements to their head turns, freezing whenever they scanned her sector. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, baking the moisture out of the ground and turning the forest floor into a steam bath. Insects buzzed around her face, landing on her skin, but she didn't flinch. She was a part of the landscape now, a collection of shadows and green-brown patterns. She could see other candidates being signaled out by the instructors, their clumsy movements or poor use of cover giving them away. One by one, the field thinned. When she finally reached her shooting position, her heart was thumping against the forest floor. She slowly eased her rifle into the crook of a fallen log, ensuring the muzzle was hidden by a clump of ferns. She took a breath, centered her sights on the target, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the blank round echoed through the woods. She remained motionless, counting the seconds. No one pointed her out. She chambered the second round and fired again. Still, the observers remained oblivious to her location. When the whistle finally blew to end the drill, Elena stood up from a patch of brush that the observers had scanned a dozen times. Walker looked at his watch, then at her, and made a single, sharp note on his clipboard. He didn't offer a compliment, but the lack of a reprimand was a victory in itself. As the candidates gathered to head back to the barracks, she saw Dietrich looking at her with a new expression, one that wasn't quite respect, but was no longer pure derision. He had seen her move, and he knew now that she wasn't just a story from a distant war. Back at the barracks, the atmosphere had shifted slightly. The initial bravado of the first day was being replaced by the grim realization of the work ahead. Men were nursing blisters, cleaning grit out of their weapons, and staring blankly at the walls. Elena sat on her bunk, methodically cleaning her rifle. She knew this was only the beginning. The school would get harder, the stalks longer, the shots more demanding. They would be tested on land navigation, target detection, and the grueling hog's tooth evaluations. As she worked, she felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't the female sergeant who went rogue. She was just a candidate, number 17, fighting for a place in a brotherhood that didn't give a damn about anything but the mission. She thought of Rodriguez back in Afghanistan, probably sitting on that same perimeter wall, and felt a surge of gratitude. She had been given a second chance, a way to turn her defiance into a profession. The evening sun cast long shadows across the squad bay. Elena finished with her rifle and began to prep her gear for the next day. She knew the eyes were still on her, that some were still waiting for her to break, to cry, or to quit. But they didn't know the girl from the coast basin. They didn't know the hours she had spent in the silence of the mountains, waiting for the world to reveal its secrets. She wasn't just going to survive this school, she was going to master it. Because in the end, the rifle didn't care who pulled the trigger, and the wind didn't care whose name was on the uniform. Only the hit mattered, and Elena Cruz never missed. As the lights in the barracks dimmed and the command for taps echoed through the base, she pulled her blanket up, her body aching but her mind sharp. Tomorrow would bring more pain, more heat, and more challenges. But as she closed her eyes, she could still feel the weight of the letter in her locker, the words of a commander who had seen her at her worst and believed in her at her best. She was a scout sniper candidate, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. The days that followed were a relentless cycle of physical exhaustion and mental strain. The instructors, led by the ever-watchful gunnery Sergeant Walker, seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to find the one thing each candidate struggled with. For some, it was the complex mathematics of windage and elevation at extreme ranges. For others, it was the soul-crushing boredom of a 12-hour observation exercise where they had to record every minute detail of a simulated village without being seen. Elena found herself thriving in the technical aspects of the course. Her time in the mountains had given her an intuitive understanding of how air moved through valleys and how light played tricks on the eyes at dawn and dusk. When they moved to the long-distance ranges, she consistently placed her shots in the center of the black, her groups tight and consistent. The instructors watched her with a critical eye, looking for any sign of ego or complacency, but they found none. She treated every shot as if it were the one that would save a life, her focus so intense that the rest of the world ceased to exist. The stalking exercises became increasingly complex. They were moved to different environments, pine forests, swampy marshes, and open fields with minimal cover. Elena learned to think 3 moves ahead, anticipating where the observers would look and where the natural shadows would fall as the sun moved across the sky. She learned the art of vegging up, using local flora to break up the telltale silhouette of a human head and shoulders. She became a student of the microterrain, finding concealment in depressions only a few inches deep. Despite her performance, the social friction in the barracks remained. Dietrich and his small circle of followers continued to treat her with a cold distance, though their overt sabotage had stopped after Walker had caught another candidate trying to hide a classmate's gear, and had punished the entire platoon with a 4-hour, remedial, physical training session in the mud. The shared misery of the collective punishment had a way of tempering individual grudges, but the underlying tension never fully dissipated. One night, during a rare hour of downtime, Sergeant Morrison sat down near her. He had become a quiet ally, someone she could discuss technical data with without the baggage of her reputation. He asked her about the coast basin, not out of curiosity for the hero story, but because he wanted to understand the tactical reality of such a high-volume engagement. Elena spoke of the heat, the way the sound of the shots seemed to be swallowed by the vastness of the valley, and the heavy, metallic smell of spent brass. She described the mental state she had entered, a place where time slowed down and the world was reduced to the space between her eye and the reticle. Morrison nodded, his own experiences in Helmand reflecting in his eyes. He told her that most people thought being a sniper was about the shooting, but they both knew it was really about the waiting. It was about the discipline to stay still when every muscle in your body was screaming for movement, and the clarity to make a decision when the rest of the world was in chaos. He told her she had that clarity, and that it was something that couldn't be taught in a school. The midpoint of the course brought the dreaded finish stalk, an exercise designed to test every skill they had learned under conditions of extreme fatigue. They were dropped off miles from their objective with minimal gear and told to navigate to a target area, conduct a reconnaissance, and then execute a stalk and shot. They were given 48 hours to complete the mission, with instructors acting as hunter-killer teams roaming the woods to find them. Elena moved alone, her mind tuned to the frequencies of the forest. She avoided the obvious paths, moving through the thickest, most difficult terrain to minimize her signature. She slept in short, 90-minute bursts, her rifle always within reach. The humidity was stifling, and the mosquitoes were a constant, buzzing torment, but she ignored them. On the second night, she found herself pinned down by a hunter-killer team using thermal optics. She buried herself under a layer of wet leaves and mud, slowing her breathing to lower her heat signature. She stayed there for 4 hours, motionless, as the patrol passed within 20 feet of her position. When she finally reached the objective and took her shot, she was exhausted, covered in mud, and bitten nearly raw by insects. But as she checked in with the instructors at the finish line, she saw the look in Walker's eyes. It wasn't praise, but it was a quiet acknowledgement. She had passed one of the hardest tests the school had to offer, and she had done it with a level of skill that even he couldn't find fault with. As the final weeks of the course approached, the attrition rate began to take its toll. Of the original 30 candidates, only 12 remained. Dietrich was still there, his bravado replaced by a grim, dogged determination. Morrison was there too, his experience and steady nerves carrying him through the most difficult days. And Elena was there, the rogue sergeant, who had become a cornerstone of the class. The final evaluation was a multi-day operation that combined everything they had learned. It was a test of endurance, marksmanship, and tactical brilliance. As they prepared to head into the field for the last time, Elena felt a sense of profound calm. She looked at the men around her, the few who had survived the gauntlet, and realized that they were no longer looking at her as a woman or a news story. They were looking at her as a teammate, a fellow professional who had earned her place in the dirt beside them. The transition from the dusty valleys of Afghanistan to the green forests of North Carolina had been more than just a change in geography. It had been a transformation. Elena Cruz had walked into that school with a reprimand on her record and a chip on her shoulder. She was leaving it as something else entirely. She was a scout sniper. And as she stepped off into the woods for her final mission, she knew that no matter what happened next, she had found her purpose. The world was wide, the targets were many, and she was ready for whatever lay beyond the next ridge. The pre-dawn air at the training facility was thick with a damp, clinging chill that seemed to seep through the very walls of the barracks. For Elena Cruz, the physical demands of the Scout Sniper course were a known quantity, a challenge she had prepared for with every fiber of her being. She knew how to push her body until it screamed, how to find that secondary reserve of strength when her lungs felt like they were filled with hot lead. But the stalking drill was a different beast entirely. It was a realm of unknown variables, a psychological chess match where the board was made of dirt and thorns, and the opponent was always watching through high-powered glass. In the world of the sniper, unknown variables were more than just obstacles. They were lethal threats. At 0430, the silence of the barracks was shattered by the tectonic roar of gunnery Sergeant Walker's voice. It wasn't just a wake-up call. It was a psychological assault designed to instantly transition the candidates from deep sleep to high-intensity readiness. Walker moved through the center aisle like a force of nature, his shadow looming large against the flickering fluorescent lights. He told them to rise and shine, reminding them that PT formation was in exactly 10 minutes. He wanted to find out who was serious and who was simply wasting his time. There was no room for the groggy or the slow. Elena was off her rack before the first sentence was finished, her movements clinical and practiced. The morning physical training session was not the standard 3-mile run they had grown accustomed to. Instead, Walker led them on a brutal 6-mile trek through sandy, uneven terrain that seemed designed to sabotage every stride. The sand was soft and deep, sucking at their boots and draining the explosive power from their legs with every step. It was a rhythmic, soul-crushing exercise in endurance. Walker set a pace that felt less like a run and more like a high-speed pursuit, his voice booming over the sound of heavy breathing and rhythmic footfalls. He shouted encouragements that carried the sharp edge of a threat, reminding them that the enemy wouldn't wait for them to catch their breath. Elena tucked herself into the middle of the pack, her eyes focused on the back of the person in front of her. She wasn't looking for glory or the top spot yet. She was focused on maintenance and conservation of energy. She kept her breathing steady, a 3-count inhale and a 3-count exhale, matching her pace to the cadence of the group. Dietrich, however, was clearly struggling with his ego. For the first 3 miles, he pushed himself to stay right beside her, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to prove he was the dominant physical presence. Elena didn't engage. She simply held her line. By mile 4, the bravado began to fail him. Dietrich's stride grew heavy, his shoulders slumped, and he started to fade toward the back of the pack. Elena didn't speed up, but as her rhythm remained constant, she naturally pulled ahead. By the time they hit the 6-mile mark and crossed the finish line, she was in the top third of the class. Morrison had taken the lead, crossing first with a stoic expression, but Elena was solid. Dietrich finished 2 minutes later, his body bent double as he heaved for air, the humiliation of his performance visible in the set of his jaw. After a breakfast that felt more like a refueling stop than a meal, they were loaded into the back of transport trucks. The destination was the training area, a sprawling expanse of scrubland and low vegetation that would serve as their crucible for the day. The field exercise was exactly what Morrison had predicted during their late-night hushed conversations. A 5-mile movement to an observation point, followed immediately by a stalking drill. The goal was simple in theory, but agonizing in practice. Approach a target without being spotted by Walker or the other senior instructors who were actively hunting for them with high-end optics. Elena adjusted her pack straps, feeling the familiar weight settle against her spine. She welcomed the comfortable discomfort of a long ruck march. This was the part of the job she knew intimately. This was just work, the steady application of pressure over time. As the miles ticked by under the unrelenting sun, the environment began to do Walker's job for him. The combination of the heavy load, the distance, and the rising heat began to pick the class apart. 4 candidates dropped out before they even reached the stalking course, their wills breaking under the sheer physical monotony of the march. Walker showed them zero sympathy, his voice cold as he told them that if they couldn't handle a basic movement, they had no business trying to be snipers. He ordered them onto the truck with a flick of his wrist, dismissing them from his sight as if they had never existed. The stalking drill itself was the final blow for another 3 candidates. The instructors were positioned on a high ridge, equipped with powerful binoculars and spotting scopes, scanning the landscape for any unnatural movement, any glint of glass, or any shadow that didn't belong. The candidates were required to crawl 300 meters through low, punishing vegetation, set up a concealed hide, and take a simulated shot without being detected. Elena sat back for a moment, watching the first few attempts. She wasn't just resting, she was studying. She watched the way the instructors' eyes moved, identifying the patterns in their sweeps and noting where their attention tended to linger. When it was finally her turn, she became a part of the earth. She moved with a glacial, agonizing slowness, using every microfold in the terrain for concealment. Inches became her measure of progress. She controlled her breathing to keep her chest from rising too high, freezing into a statue whenever she sensed an instructor's optics sweeping in her direction. Her world shrank to the square inch of dirt directly in front of her face and the sound of her own heartbeat. It took her 47 minutes to cover those 300 meters. By the time she reached her firing point, her body was a map of aches and sweat was stinging her eyes, but she had remained a ghost. "Shot," she called out softly into a radio. Walker's voice crackled back with immediate clinical coldness. "Miss, you're 4 feet left of the target. Try again, Cruz." Elena didn't let the frustration reach her heart. She took a breath, adjusted her position by a fraction of an inch, and recalculated the wind and the angle. She settled back into the rifle, finding that perfect pocket of stillness where the world disappeared. She called her second shot. "Hit," Walker replied, his tone still devoid of praise. "Candidate Cruz, you are clear to extract." The extraction was nearly as grueling as the approach. Elena had to low-crawl back the way she had come, her muscles screaming in protest at the repetitive, straining motions. But she made it back to the rally point without being spotted. Walker was waiting there, checking his watch. He told her it wasn't bad, though she was slow as hell. He acknowledged that she was technically sound, but warned her that tomorrow he expected her to do it in half the time. That night, when Elena finally collapsed onto her rack, she felt as though she had been hit by a freight train. Every joint throbbed and her skin was raw from the crawl. But she had passed. Day 1 was complete, leaving 90 more to go. The following weeks dissolved into a relentless, blurring cycle of pain, exhaustion, and incremental improvement. Every morning began before the sun dared to show itself, with muscles that screamed in protest against the very act of moving. They ran until their lungs burned and their vision blurred, and they spent countless hours in the dirt, perfecting skills that often seemed impossible to master. The stalking drills, in particular, became Elena's nemesis and her obsession. Walker was a demanding taskmaster, constantly pushing her to cut her times. He wanted her to move through the terrain at speeds that felt reckless, yet he demanded the same level of near-invisible stealth. It was a paradox that required a deep, intuitive understanding of the environment, learning to move with the wind and use the natural shadows as a cloak. By the end of the 3rd week, the class had been pruned from 30 candidates down to 19. 7 had quit of their own volition, unable to handle the psychological grind, while 4 others had been dropped for failing to meet the increasingly stringent standards. The pressure was constant and deliberate, a precision tool designed by the instructors to find the smallest cracks in a person's character and exploit them until they shattered. Dietrich was one of those who broke. On day 17, after failing his 3rd consecutive stalking evaluation, the frustration finally boiled over. Elena watched from the periphery as he threw his gear into a sea bag, his face a mask of crimson humiliation and rage. He announced to the room that Walker was grading on a curve and that certain people were receiving favorable treatment. He looked directly at Elena as he said it, the bitterness in his eyes unmistakable. Morrison, who was nearby meticulously cleaning his rifle, didn't even look up. He simply remarked that perhaps Dietrich just sucked at stalking and asked if he had ever considered that possibility. Dietrich's response was a string of vitriol aimed at Morrison and the program before he shouldered his bag and walked out, leaving a heavy, uncomfortable silence in his wake. Walker appeared in the doorway moments later, his presence alone enough to pull the room back to attention. He asked if anyone else wanted to quit, stating there was no shame in recognizing the path wasn't for them. No one moved. He gave a sharp nod and informed them that tomorrow they would begin long-range shooting qualifications. That, he said, was where they would separate the people who could actually do the job from those who merely thought they could. His eyes locked onto Elena's. He told her she would be up first at 0600 on range 12 and warned her not to be late. That night, sleep was an impossible luxury for Elena. Being placed first wasn't a mark of distinction. It was a deliberate test of her nerves. Walker wanted to see how she would perform with the eyes of the entire class on her, with no opportunity to observe others or learn from their mistakes. She arrived at range 12 at 0545, her rifle cleaned to a surgical standard, her data book organized, and her mind sharpened to a fine point. Walker arrived exactly at 0600, the rest of the class trailing behind him like a funeral procession. He laid out the parameters of the test with cold efficiency. Sergeant Cruz would be shooting at targets ranging from 800 to 1,000 meters. He would call the distances and the conditions, and she would have 30 seconds to make each shot. There were 5 targets in total, and missing more than one meant an immediate failure of the evolution. Elena settled into her shooting position, the familiar weight of the rifle becoming an extension of her own body. She allowed her breathing to slow, letting her physiology relax into the geometry of the weapon. This was her home. This was the place where the uncertainty of the world was replaced by the absolute truths of mathematics and physics. The first target was at 800 meters, with a 10 mph wind coming from the right. Elena made her calculations, dialed the adjustments into her scope, and squeezed the trigger. The target dropped, hit. The second target was at 850 meters with a variable wind. Elena led the moving target, accounting for the drift, and fired at the exact millisecond when the universe aligned. Hit. The third target was at 900 meters from an elevated position, requiring a different set of mathematical adjustments to account for gravity's effect on an angled trajectory. She ran the numbers in her head, adjusted, and fired. Hit. The fourth target was the real test. 950 meters with a 20 mph crosswind, partially obscured by thick vegetation. At that distance, the wind creates a massive drift, and the obscuration meant she had only a fleeting window to see her mark. Elena watched the way the vegetation swayed, timing the gusts and calculated where the target would be in the gap. She fired. Hit. The final target was at 1,000 meters, a target the size of a dinner plate in shifting winds. Elena took her time, watching the mirage through her scope, reading the way the air itself danced. She committed to the shot, the rifle bucked against her shoulder, and through the glass, she watched the round travel through the air until the target fell. 5 for 5. Walker's voice remained flat as he told the class that what they had just seen was the standard. He told them that if they couldn't match or exceed Sergeant Cruz's performance, they didn't belong in his course. Elena stood up, feeling the weight of 18 pairs of eyes on her. Some were filled with a newfound respect, while others simmered with resentment. Morrison gave her a nearly imperceptible nod. By the end of the day, only 6 other candidates had matched her perfect score. 3 more failed entirely and were removed from the course. By the evening formation, the class had been whittled down to 16 survivors. Walker addressed them with his typical lack of warmth, noting that they were 4 weeks in and half the class was already gone. He announced the next phase, field training. 2 weeks of living in the woods, stalking live targets, and operating under realistic combat conditions. He warned them that this was where most of the remaining candidates would wash out, and told them to make peace with their gods, because tomorrow the real training would begin. The field training phase was a descent into a specific kind of hell. They operated in 4-man teams, surviving on minimal rations and perhaps 2 hours of broken sleep a night. They were conducting stalking exercises against instructors who were themselves qualified snipers, men with years of experience hunting people who knew they were being hunted. Elena found herself teamed with Morrison, a quiet and intensely focused sergeant named Park, and a lance corporal named Delgado. Despite their different backgrounds, the 4 of them gelled almost instantly. Morrison was the anchor, methodical and impossible to rattle. Park had an uncanny ability to read terrain, finding routes through the brush that looked impassable. Delgado possessed the patience of a mountain, able to hold a position for hours without a single twitch, and Elena was their primary shooter. Their first mission was a simulated high-value target elimination. They were tasked with identifying a specific instructor hidden somewhere within a 2-kilometer sector, stalking within 300 meters, and making a confirmed hit with a training round. They spent the first 6 hours of the mission in total silence, simply observing and mapping the patrol patterns of the security force. Morrison made the tactical call to move at dusk, using the transition of light to their advantage. The stalk itself was a grueling 4-hour ordeal. Elena led the way, moving with agonizing precision through vegetation that seemed designed to snag on every piece of gear. Behind her, Morrison and Park followed her path with surgical accuracy, while Delgado kept watch on their rear. At 280 meters, Elena found her spot, a slight depression in the earth shielded by a fallen log. She built a hide out of natural debris and waited. 3 hours passed in total stillness. Her body screamed at her to move to stretch the cramps out of her legs, but she pushed the pain into a dark corner of her mind. At 0300, the target appeared. It was Chief Warrant Officer Hayes, a legend in the community. Elena centered her reticle, breathed out half a breath, and fired. The training round struck Hayes' center mass. Hit confirmed. Hayes' voice crackled over the radio, laced with a hint of genuine surprise. Team 2, well done. Extract and return to base. The extraction was a frantic game of cat and mouse, moving 3 kilometers through the woods while security patrols actively hunted them. Morrison led them on a circuitous route that bypassed every logical path, and they reached base camp just as the first light of dawn began to bleed into the sky. Walker was waiting. He noted their time, 8 hours for ID and engagement, and called it a textbook stalk. It was the closest thing to a compliment Elena had ever received from him, but she knew it only meant the next task would be harder. Their second mission was an endurance test, a 2-day movement to an observation post followed by 72 hours of continuous surveillance on a simulated enemy compound. It was a test of light and noise discipline, of data collection, and of the sheer mental fortitude required to stay awake and alert while consuming nothing but cold rations. Elena took the first watch, then rotated with Morrison. On the 68th hour of the watch, through the haze of exhaustion, Elena spotted a pattern. She noticed that during the guard rotations every 4 hours, there was a 90-second window where the northeastern approach was completely unmonitored. When she brought it to Morrison, he studied her notes with a frown of concentration. He agreed with her assessment and keyed the radio to request permission for a simulated infiltration. Walker granted it but added a cryptic warning that the compound had security measures they hadn't yet observed. They planned the move with obsessive detail. At hour 71, they moved. Elena reached the blind spot with seconds to spare, slipped through the perimeter, placed the simulated explosive charge, and vanished back into the woods before the rotation was complete. Back at the OP, they waited for the verdict. Walker's voice came over the radio, confirming the hit but dropping a bombshell. They had successfully penetrated the perimeter, but they had also tripped 2 infrared sensors that hadn't been part of their briefing. In a real-world scenario, the team would have been compromised. Mission success, he said, but a tactical failure. The words felt like a physical blow. They had done the job, but they had missed the invisible details that would have cost them their lives. The subsequent debrief was brutal, with Walker dissecting every assumption they had made. He used their failure as a lesson for the entire class. Mission success wasn't enough. You had to survive the mission. By week 8, the class was down to 12. Delgado had been the latest casualty, a severe ankle injury during a night movement forcing a medical drop. Elena could feel the transformation in herself. Her body had become a lean, efficient machine, and her mind was now a processor for tactical data, capable of making life-or-death decisions under immense pressure. The final test in week 12 was the culmination of everything, a 48-hour solo exercise involving long-range shooting, stalking, and escape and evasion. Elena's first objective was a 1,000-meter shot on a target visible for only a 2-minute window. She nailed it on the first attempt. Her second was an 18-hour surveillance of a command post, where she identified 12 personnel and their routines without ever being seen. The final objective was a 15-kilometer trek to an extraction point while being hunted by an aggressor force that knew she was out there. She avoided every obvious trail, moving through the thickest, most difficult terrain she could find. She traveled by night and vanished into the earth by day. At hour 46, she reached the extraction point where Walker stood waiting. He checked his stopwatch and informed her that she had completed all objectives with no detections and had 2 hours to spare. He then told her something she never expected to hear. She had just set the course record for the exercise. He congratulated her, and for the first time in 3 months, Elena felt the crushing weight of the pressure lift from her chest. Walker told her that she had proven that what happened at Karsa Basin wasn't luck. It was talent, training, and the mental toughness to perform when the world was falling apart. He extended his hand and welcomed her to the Scout Sniper community. The graduation ceremony was a somber, intimate affair. Only 12 men and 1 woman remained out of the original 30. They stood in their dress uniforms as Walker approached with the Scout Sniper badges. When he reached Elena, his voice carried across the small formation, formally designating her as a United States Marine Corps Scout Sniper. He told her to wear the badge with pride and to remember that it represented the lives of every Marine who would one day depend on her. As he pinned the crossed rifles over the skull onto her uniform, Elena felt the cold metal against her chest, a small object that represented every sacrifice she had made. After the ceremony, Morrison found her. He told her he was heading back to his unit and that they were deploying to Helmand Province in 4 months. He said he had spoken to his battalion commander and that they were looking for snipers. He told her if she wanted the transfer, the spot was hers. Elena didn't hesitate. She shook his hand and told him she'd see him there. Later, sitting on the steps of the barracks as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elena looked at her phone. She had a message from Rodriguez asking if she'd made it. She smiled and typed back that she had graduated in the top 5 and was officially a sniper. Rodriguez's reply was instant, full of his usual bravado, but he grew quiet when she mentioned she was heading back to Afghanistan. He told her she really couldn't stay away from that place. Elena looked out over the training grounds, thinking of Karsa Basin, the Marines she had lost, and the mission that still lay ahead. She typed back that there was still work to do. She pocketed the phone and felt the badge on her chest. The girl who had been invisible at FOB Alvarado was gone. In her place was a warrior who had proven that courage often meant standing alone, that being right was more important than being obedient, and that the only true measure of a person was their performance under fire. Elena Cruz had walked into a trap meant to end her career and had emerged as an elite hunter. She had saved hundreds of lives by trusting her gut, and now she was exactly where she was meant to be, operating in the shadows, protecting her brothers and sisters with a precision that was now undeniable. The invisible sniper was finally seen, and her story was only just beginning.